The autumn air carried a sharp chill through the narrow streets of the South Bronx on October 27th, 1940, as Filomena de Carlo Gotti held her newborn son for the first time. The child, who would one day become known as John Joseph Gotti Jr., entered a world already marked by struggle, where the American dream seemed as distant as the wealthy neighborhoods across the Harlem River. Outside the cramped tenement apartment on 134th Street, the sounds of the city pressed against thin walls. Children played stickball in the streets, their voices mixing with the rumble of elevated trains and the occasional shouts of vendors hawking their wares from wooden carts. Philomena, known to everyone as Fanny, was a small woman with fierce dark eyes and calloused hands that spoke of endless work. She had arrived in America from Italy as a young girl, carrying dreams that had slowly been worn down by the harsh realities of immigrant life in New York City. Her husband, John Joseph Gotti Sr., stood awkwardly in the corner of the room, his weathered face showing the toll of too many sleepless nights and too many empty bottles. At 31, he already looked older, his shoulders bent from years of intermittent labor and the weight of supporting a growing family on wages that never seemed to stretch far enough. The Gotti family lived in a world where survival often meant bending rules and where respect was earned through toughness rather than education or social standing. The South Bronx of the 1940s was a neighborhood in transition, filled with families who had fled the poverty of Europe only to find a different kind of hardship waiting in America. Italian immigrants clustered together in tight-knit communities, preserving old-world traditions while struggling to understand the complex social hierarchies of their new homeland. Young John's earliest memories would be shaped by the constant presence of want. The apartment was small and poorly heated, with thin walls that provided little privacy and windows that looked out onto fire escapes and narrow alleyways. During the bitter New York winters, the family would gather around a small gas stove for warmth, sharing stories and meals that stretched whatever money his father had managed to earn that week. These were the moments when the family felt most connected, when the outside world seemed held at bay by the simple act of being together. John Sr. was a complex figure in his son's early life, present but unreliable, loving but increasingly distant, as alcohol became his primary companion. He worked sporadically as a day laborer, taking whatever jobs were available at construction sites, loading docks, or anywhere else that strong backs were needed more than steady employment records. Some weeks he would come home with enough money to pay the rent and put food on the table. Other weeks he would disappear for days at a time, leaving Fanny to explain his absence to increasingly skeptical landlords and worried children. The older residents of the neighborhood remembered a time when Italian families had first begun arriving in large numbers, bringing with them a culture that valued family loyalty above almost everything else. They spoke in hushed tones about the old country, about villages where everyone knew everyone else's business, and where disputes were settled through careful negotiation between respected elders. But America was different, they would say with a mixture of pride and resignation. Here, a man had to make his own way, and sometimes that meant making compromises with principles that had seemed unshakable in the mountains of Sicily or the valleys of Campania. As young John grew from infant to toddler, the patterns of his future personality began to emerge. He was larger than other children his age, with dark hair and intense eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. More importantly, he displayed an early inclination toward leadership, gathering other children around him through a combination of charisma and mild intimidation that would serve him well in the years to come. Even at the age of 3 or 4, Neighbors noted that when John Gotti spoke, other children listened. The family's financial struggles became more acute as more children arrived. John was followed by brothers and sisters who crowded into the small apartment, sleeping two and three to a bed and sharing clothes that were passed down until they could no longer be repaired. Fanny worked tirelessly to stretch every dollar, shopping for day old bread and vegetables that were past their prime, darning socks until they were more thread than original material, and finding ways to make meals from ingredients that more prosperous families would have discarded. By the time John reached school age, the family had moved several times within the Bronx, each relocation representing either an eviction for unpaid rent or a desperate search for cheaper housing. These frequent moves meant that young John rarely had time to form lasting friendships or develop the kind of stable relationships that might have anchored him to conventional paths. Instead, he learned to adapt quickly to new environments, to establish his place in new social hierarchies, and to protect himself and his siblings in neighborhoods where weakness was quickly exploited. The streets of the South Bronx provided a harsh but effective education in the realities of power and respect. John observed how older boys commanded deference through physical strength and willingness to fight. He watched how certain men in the neighborhood seemed to have money when others were struggling, how they dressed better and spoke with confidence that came from some unspoken source of security. These men would nod respectfully to elderly Italian women while conducting quiet conversations in social clubs and corner barber shops that seemed to serve purposes beyond their obvious functions. School represented both opportunity and frustration for the young boy. He was intelligent enough to understand that education might offer a path to a better life, but the classroom environment felt foreign and restrictive compared to the lessons he was learning on the street. Teachers, mostly middle class women who commuted from safer neighborhoods, often seemed unable to understand the realities of their students' lives. They spoke about following rules and working hard, concepts that seemed abstract when your father might not come home for days and your mother was counting pennies to buy milk. The cultural divide between home and school created a sense of alienation that would follow John throughout his youth. At home, he heard stories about the old country, about men who commanded respect through strength and cunning rather than formal education. Success was measured not by grades or diplomas, but by the ability to provide for family and to maintain dignity in the face of adversity. These values, transmitted through countless small conversations and observations, would prove far more influential than anything he learned in overcrowded classrooms, where teachers struggled to maintain order and provide individual attention. As John entered his preteen years, the family made a decision that would prove crucial to his development. John Sr., recognizing that the South Bronx was becoming increasingly dangerous and that opportunities for legitimate work were becoming scarcer, decided to move the family to East New York, Brooklyn. This neighborhood, while still working class and predominantly Italian, offered what seemed like better prospects for raising children and finding steady employment. The move to Brooklyn represented both hope and a fateful step toward a different kind of future. East New York, in the early 1950s, was a neighborhood where organized crime was woven into the social fabric in ways that residents rarely discussed openly but always understood. Here, the lessons about respect and power that John had begun learning in the Bronx would be refined and focused in ways that would set him on a path toward a life that his parents could never have imagined when they first held their newborn son in that cramped South Bronx apartment. The boy who would become known as the Dapper Don was being shaped by forces larger than any individual family's circumstances, molded by the intersection of poverty, cultural displacement, and the peculiar opportunities that existed in neighborhoods where conventional society's rules seemed negotiable and where respect could be earned through very different means than those taught in schools or churches. The transition to East New York, Brooklyn in 1952, marked a subtle but significant shift in the trajectory of young John Gotti's life. At 12 years old, he was beginning to understand that the world operated according to rules that were rarely written down but always enforced. The neighborhood presented him with new opportunities and new temptations, each one drawing him further away from the conventional path that his mother still hoped he might follow. Franklin K. Lane High School stood like a fortress of institutional authority on the corner of Jamaica Avenue, its red brick facade weathered by decades of New York winters and summers. The building housed over 3,000 students, most of them children of immigrants who carried their families' dreams for advancement in America. For John, however, the school represented something entirely different. It was a place where he felt confined, misunderstood, and increasingly alienated from the future that teachers and guidance counselors insisted he should want. The classrooms were overcrowded, with teachers struggling to maintain order among students who brought the tensions and conflicts of their neighborhoods into the academic environment. John found himself drawn to the windows, watching the street, life below, where real lessons in power and survival were being taught every day. The formal education system seemed disconnected from the realities he understood, focused on abstract concepts that bore little relationship to the immediate challenges of life in East New York. His first serious encounter with the juvenile justice system came during the autumn of 1956, when he was arrested for disorderly conduct following a street fight that had started over a perceived slight to his younger brother. The incident itself was minor, the kind of scuffle that occurred daily in neighborhoods throughout Brooklyn, but for John, it represented a crucial moment of recognition. Standing in the precinct house, watching how certain adults commanded respect from police officers while others were dismissed or ignored, he began to understand that there were different categories of people in the world, and that category was determined by more than education or legitimate employment. The streets of East New York provided a more compelling classroom than anything within the walls of Franklin Lane High School. Here, young men learned about territory and respect, about the importance of reputation and the consequences of weakness. The neighborhood was divided into informal zones of influence, each controlled by different groups who maintained order through carefully calibrated combinations of friendship, intimidation, and violence. John began to study these dynamics with the same intensity that other students might have applied to mathematics or literature. Winter mornings in Brooklyn carried a particular quality of light that filtered through the bare branches of aging trees and reflected off the windows of tenement buildings. John would walk these streets before school, observing the rhythms of neighborhood life. He watched how certain men emerged from social clubs at specific times, how conversations stopped when strangers approached, how money changed hands in transactions that were completed with handshakes rather than receipts. These observations accumulated into a practical education in the informal economy that operated parallel to the legitimate world that teachers and parents spoke about with such reverence. The first time John skipped school entirely, he spent the day exploring areas of Brooklyn that were forbidden to respectable children. He walked through neighborhoods where loading docks provided opportunities for enterprising individuals, where abandoned buildings served purposes that were never discussed in polite company, and where young men his age were engaged in activities that promised immediate financial rewards rather than the distant and uncertain benefits of education. The experience was intoxicating, providing a sense of freedom and possibility that the classroom had never offered. Truancy became a regular pattern, with John developing increasingly sophisticated methods for avoiding detection by school authorities and parents. He learned to forge notes, to time his absences strategically, and to maintain just enough presence in school to avoid triggering serious interventions. During these unauthorized excursions, he began to associate with older boys who had already abandoned any pretense of conventional paths to success. They spoke with casual authority about matters that seemed impossibly adult to someone who was barely 16 years old. The social dynamics of street life required a different kind of intelligence than what was valued in academic settings. John discovered that he possessed an intuitive understanding of group psychology, an ability to read situations and people that served him well in environments where miscalculation could have serious consequences. He learned when to assert himself and when to step back, how to project strength without unnecessary provocation, and most importantly, how to inspire loyalty among peers who had little reason to trust anyone. His first arrest for theft occurred during the spring of 1957 when he was caught attempting to steal cigarettes from a neighborhood store. The crime itself was relatively minor, but it represented a crossing of a line that separated legitimate citizens from those who operated outside conventional society. Standing before a juvenile court judge, John experienced a moment of clarity about the path he was choosing. The judge spoke about opportunities and second chances, about the importance of education and honest work. But John was no longer listening to such advice with the same receptivity that he might have shown even a year earlier. The juvenile detention facility, where he spent several weeks, provided another form of education entirely. Here, surrounded by other young men who had made similar choices, John began to understand the hierarchies and codes that governed criminal society. Respect was earned through demonstrations of toughness and reliability. Information was currency, and the ability to maintain silence under pressure was valued above almost any other quality. These lessons would prove far more influential in shaping his future than anything he had learned in conventional classrooms. Upon his release, John returned to a neighborhood that seemed to view his brief incarceration as a badge of credibility rather than a source of shame. Certain older residents nodded to him with new respect, recognizing that he had crossed a threshold that separated serious individuals from those who merely talked about toughness. This recognition was intoxicating for a teenager who had always felt that his talents were undervalued by conventional society. The relationship with his parents became increasingly strained as John's activities became more difficult to ignore or rationalize. His father, perhaps recognizing elements of his own struggles with authority in his son's behavior, responded with a mixture of anger and resignation that solved nothing. His mother continued to hope that education might still provide a path to respectability, but her pleas carried less weight than the immediate rewards and recognition that John found on the street. The decision to leave school permanently came during his junior year, when the gap between his interests and the institution's requirements had become impossible to bridge. The dropout process was surprisingly bureaucratic, requiring meetings with guidance counselors who spoke earnestly about the long-term consequences of abandoning formal education. John listened politely to these conversations, but his mind was already focused on opportunities that existed outside the world of diplomas and conventional careers. The neighborhoods surrounding East New York offered numerous possibilities for young men who were willing to accept certain risks in exchange for immediate income. Loading docks at John F. Kennedy International Airport employed workers who were not always particular about the distinction between official and unofficial cargo. Construction sites throughout Queens and Brooklyn provided opportunities for individuals who understood that materials sometimes became available through channels that were not reflected in official inventory records. These activities required planning, coordination, and the kind of practical intelligence that John had been developing since childhood. His association with established criminal enterprises began gradually through introductions facilitated by older neighborhood residents who recognized his potential. These men operated social clubs and barbershops that served as informal headquarters for activities that were never discussed in detail but always understood by those who needed to know. John began by running simple errands, delivering messages and packages that required no questions and promised no explanations. These tasks allowed him to observe the sophisticated networks of relationships that connected seemingly separate criminal enterprises throughout Brooklyn and Queens. The atmosphere of these social clubs was thick with cigarette smoke and the aroma of strong coffee, punctuated by conversations conducted in mixtures of English and Italian that excluded outsiders while binding insiders together through shared language and shared secrets. Here, John learned about the importance of tradition and respect, about the careful protocols that governed interactions between different levels of criminal hierarchy. He observed how disputes were resolved through negotiation rather than immediate violence, how reputations were built through consistent demonstrations of reliability and discretion. By 1958, John had established himself as someone who could be trusted with increasingly significant responsibilities. His natural charisma and his willingness to use violence when necessary made him valuable to older criminals who were always seeking reliable subordinates. More importantly, he had begun to develop his own network of peers who looked to him for leadership and direction. This group of young men, united by their rejection of conventional society and their embrace of criminal opportunity, would form the foundation of his future organization. The transformation from troubled teenager to serious criminal had occurred gradually through a series of choices that seemed logical and even inevitable given the circumstances of his upbringing and environment. Each step had led naturally to the next, creating a momentum that carried him away from any possibility of returning to conventional paths. By the time he reached his 18th birthday, John Gotti had already committed himself to a life that would bring him both enormous power and ultimately tragic consequences. The boy who had once sat in overcrowded classrooms, dreaming of escape, had found his way into a world where respect and financial success were available to those bold enough to seize them. The lessons he had learned about loyalty, territory, and the strategic use of violence would serve him well in the years ahead as he moved from the margins of organized crime toward its very center. The autumn of 1958 brought John Gotti into closer contact with a world that operated according to rules far more complex and sophisticated than anything he had encountered in his earlier criminal activities. The Fulton Rockaway Boys, a loose confederation of young men from East New York and neighboring areas, served as his introduction to organized criminal enterprise on a scale that required genuine planning, coordination, and an understanding of the delicate relationships that connected various illegal activities throughout Brooklyn and Queens. The social club on 101st Avenue in Ozone Park became John's second home during this period, a place where the education he had abandoned at Franklin K. Lane High School was replaced by instruction in subjects that no conventional curriculum would ever include. The building itself was unremarkable from the outside, a narrow storefront squeezed between a barber shop and a small grocery store with windows that had been painted over to prevent casual observation from the street. Inside, however, it functioned as a university of criminal knowledge, where lessons were taught through observation, conversation, and carefully supervised participation in increasingly sophisticated operations. Carmine Fatico presided over this informal academy with the patience and wisdom of a professor who understood that the wrong lesson, improperly learned, could result in consequences far more serious than academic failure. Fatico was a man in his 40s, with graying hair and hands that bore the scars of a youth spent in manual labor before he discovered more profitable applications for his intelligence and organizational skills. He spoke softly, requiring those around him to listen carefully, and his approval was something that the young men under his guidance sought with an intensity that surprised them. The daily routine of the social club followed patterns that had been established over decades of criminal activity in Brooklyn. Members would arrive in the late morning after the legitimate world had begun its workday, and conversations would begin with coffee that was always brewing in a pot that seemed never to be empty. These discussions covered a wide range of topics, from neighborhood gossip to sophisticated analyses of law enforcement activities, from family concerns to business opportunities that required careful evaluation before any commitment of resources or personnel. John learned to read the subtle hierarchies that governed every interaction within the club. Seating arrangements were not random, but reflected status and relationships that had been established through years of shared experience and mutual dependence. Newer members like himself were expected to listen more than they spoke, to ask questions that demonstrated genuine interest rather than mere curiosity, and to understand that information was shared selectively based on need and proven reliability. The concept of omerta, the code of silence that bound members of this community together, was not explained through formal instruction, but absorbed through countless small demonstrations of its importance. John observed how conversations stopped when strangers approached, how certain topics were never discussed in specific locations, and how the most serious business was conducted through carefully arranged meetings that left no record of their occurrence. The psychological discipline required to maintain such discretion became second nature through constant practice and the understanding that violations carried consequences that were swift and permanent. Winter afternoons in the social club had a particular quality of light that filtered through the painted windows, creating an atmosphere that was both intimate and slightly mysterious. The men would gather around small tables, playing cards or dominoes while discussing matters that required the kind of strategic thinking that John was beginning to appreciate. These games were never simply recreation, but served as informal training in reading opponents, calculating odds, and maintaining composure under pressure. The stakes were usually small, but the lessons were invaluable for someone who was learning to navigate a world where psychological warfare was as important as physical strength. The relationship between different criminal organizations throughout New York City was explained to John through stories that illustrated both cooperation and conflict between groups that shared similar goals but operated in different territories. He learned about the careful negotiations that were required to prevent disputes from escalating into violence, about the importance of maintaining respect between organizations, even when business interests conflicted, and about the sophisticated intelligence networks that allowed criminal leaders to monitor law enforcement activities and rival group movements. Fatico's instruction extended beyond criminal techniques to include lessons in personal presentation and social behavior that would serve John well in future years. He learned about the importance of dressing appropriately for different situations, about the subtle signals that communicated status and intention to those who understood how to read them, and about the art of conversation that revealed nothing while appearing to be completely open. These skills were as important as any technical criminal knowledge because success in organized crime required the ability to move comfortably between different social environments without attracting unwanted attention. The spring of 1959 brought John's first significant responsibility within the organization when he was assigned to coordinate activities among several younger members who looked to him for leadership and direction. This role required him to develop skills in planning and delegation that would prove crucial throughout his criminal career. He learned how to assign tasks based on individual strengths and weaknesses, how to maintain discipline within a group without relying solely on intimidation, and how to balance the competing demands of profitability and security that governed all successful criminal enterprises. The neighborhood surrounding John F. Kennedy International Airport provided numerous opportunities for enterprising individuals who understood the complex logistics of modern air travel. Cargo shipments arrived daily from destinations around the world, carrying goods that ranged from everyday consumer products to luxury items that commanded premium prices in the right markets. The key to successful airport operations lay not in random theft, but in careful intelligence gathering that identified the most valuable shipments and the optimal timing for their acquisition. John's education in airport operations began with seemingly mundane assignments that required him to observe and record the patterns of legitimate activity that surrounded cargo handling. He learned to recognize the uniforms and vehicles that belonged to different airlines and freight companies, to understand the scheduling systems that governed when specific types of shipments were most vulnerable, and to identify the employees whose cooperation could be purchased or whose negligence could be exploited. This intelligence gathering was conducted with the patience and attention to detail that characterized all successful criminal enterprises. The social dynamics of airport theft required coordination between multiple individuals who performed specialized functions within carefully planned operations. Drivers needed vehicles that could blend into legitimate traffic while accommodating stolen cargo. Inside workers provided information about valuable shipments and created opportunities for theft through strategic absences or misdirection. Fence operations required connections to buyers who could move stolen goods quickly without attracting law enforcement attention. John learned to appreciate the complexity of these relationships and the importance of maintaining reliability among all participants. Summer evenings at the social club provided opportunities for more relaxed instruction in the cultural traditions that bound Italian American criminal organizations together across generations. Older members would share stories about the early days of organized crime in New York, about legendary figures whose reputations had been built through a combination of intelligence, ruthlessness, and respect for the customs that governed criminal society. These narratives served multiple purposes, entertaining younger members while transmitting important lessons about the consequences of different choices and the importance of maintaining connections to the broader criminal community. The concept of family, both biological and organizational, was central to everything John learned during this period. Criminal enterprises were not simply business relationships, but evolved into complex networks of mutual obligation and support that transcended immediate financial considerations. Members were expected to assist one another during personal difficulties, to maintain loyalty even when circumstances created temptations to defect, and to understand that individual success was meaningless without the security and respect that came from belonging to a larger organization. By the autumn of 1959, John had begun to develop his own network of reliable associates who recognized his leadership abilities and his potential for advancement within the criminal hierarchy. These relationships were built through shared experiences in increasingly challenging operations, through demonstrations of loyalty under pressure, and through the kind of personal chemistry that could not be manufactured, but had to develop naturally over time. The young men who gathered around John during this period would form the core of his future organization, bound together by memories of their early criminal education and their mutual recognition of his exceptional talents. The transition from student to teacher within the criminal community occurred gradually as John began to share his accumulated knowledge with newer members who sought guidance in navigating the complex world of organized crime. He discovered that he possessed a natural ability to explain sophisticated concepts in terms that others could understand and apply, and that his enthusiasm for criminal enterprise was infectious among those who were still uncertain about their commitment to this alternative path to success and recognition. The relationship with law enforcement during this period was characterized by a mutual understanding of boundaries and expectations that governed interactions between police and criminal organizations. Certain activities were considered acceptable risks, while others crossed lines that would trigger serious responses from investigative agencies. John learned to recognize the signs of increased law enforcement attention, to modify operations when surveillance became too intensive, and to maintain the kind of low profile that allowed criminal enterprises to flourish without attracting unwanted scrutiny from federal agencies. The winter of 1959 marked the end of John's formal apprenticeship in organized crime and the beginning of his emergence as a significant figure within the Brooklyn criminal community. The lessons he had learned from Carmine Fatico and other experienced criminals had provided him with a foundation of knowledge and relationships that would support increasingly ambitious enterprises in the years ahead. More importantly, he had developed the confidence and reputation that would allow him to attract the attention of higher-level criminal organizations that were always seeking talented individuals for more significant opportunities. The young man who had entered the social club on 101st Avenue as an eager student had evolved into someone who commanded respect through a combination of intelligence, reliability, and the kind of quiet charisma that marked natural leaders in any environment. The skills he had acquired and the relationships he had developed would soon provide him with opportunities that would test everything he had learned and determine whether his criminal education had prepared him for the challenges and responsibilities that came with genuine power in the underworld of New York City. The opportunity that would transform John Gotti from a promising neighborhood criminal into a figure of genuine significance within organized crime emerged from the sprawling complexity of John F. Kennedy International Airport during the winter of 1966. The massive transportation hub, with its endless streams of cargo flights arriving from destinations around the world, represented more than just a gateway to America. For those who understood how to navigate its labyrinthine systems of security and bureaucracy, it offered possibilities for wealth that dwarfed anything available through conventional criminal enterprises in Brooklyn's neighborhoods. The airport operated according to rhythms that had been established through decades of international commerce, with cargo planes landing at all hours of the day and night, carrying everything from everyday consumer goods to luxury items destined for Manhattan's most exclusive retailers. The sheer volume of merchandise that passed through the facility each day created opportunities for theft that were limited only by the imagination and organizational skills of those bold enough to exploit the inevitable gaps in security that characterized any system of such enormous scale and complexity. John's introduction to airport operations had begun months earlier through careful observation and intelligence gathering that revealed the patterns of legitimate activity surrounding cargo handling. He had learned to recognize the uniforms and identification badges that granted access to restricted areas, to understand the scheduling systems that governed when specific types of shipments were most vulnerable to theft, and to identify the employees whose cooperation could be purchased through a combination of financial incentives and carefully applied pressure. The loading docks at John F. Kennedy Airport presented a constantly changing landscape of opportunity, with cargo containers arriving from destinations that promised exotic and valuable contents. European flights brought luxury goods that commanded premium prices in American markets. Asian shipments contained electronics and consumer products that were in high demand throughout New York City. South American cargo often included items that were particularly valuable to those who understood their true worth and knew how to find appropriate buyers. The key to successful airport theft lay not in random opportunism, but in sophisticated intelligence networks that could identify the most valuable shipments well in advance of their arrival. This information came from various sources, including airline employees who had access to cargo manifests, freight handlers who understood the contents of specific containers, and administrative personnel who could provide details about shipping schedules and security arrangements. Building and maintaining these networks required patience, discretion, and the kind of financial resources that allowed for regular payments to ensure continued cooperation. John's crew had spent months developing relationships with inside workers who occupied strategic positions within the airport's complex hierarchy of employment. These individuals ranged from relatively low-level freight handlers who could create brief windows of opportunity for theft to more senior supervisors who could arrange for strategic absences during critical periods when valuable cargo was most vulnerable. The cultivation of these relationships required a sophisticated understanding of human psychology and the careful application of both incentives and deterrents that ensured loyalty without creating unnecessary risks. The planning for significant airport operations began weeks in advance, with detailed reconnaissance that mapped the movement of specific shipments from their arrival at the airport through their eventual delivery to legitimate recipients. This process required coordination between multiple individuals who performed specialized functions within the overall operation. Intelligence gatherers provided information about valuable cargo and optimal timing for theft. Transportation specialists arranged for vehicles that could blend into legitimate airport traffic while accommodating stolen merchandise. Security experts identified the weakest points in existing protection systems and developed strategies for avoiding detection during actual operations. The winter months of 1966 and 1967 brought a series of increasingly ambitious operations that demonstrated John's growing sophistication as a criminal organizer. Each successful theft provided lessons that improved the efficiency and security of subsequent operations, while the profits generated through these activities attracted the attention of higher level criminal organizations that were always seeking talented individuals for more significant responsibilities. The reputation that John was building through his airport activities would prove crucial in opening doors to opportunities that had previously been beyond his reach. The atmosphere surrounding major airport operations was characterized by a combination of careful planning and controlled tension that required exceptional emotional discipline from all participants. The weeks of preparation that preceded each significant theft created bonds of mutual dependence among crew members who understood that their individual safety and success depended on the reliability and discretion of their in prey associates. These relationships, forged through shared risk and common purpose, would form the foundation of John's future criminal organization. The technical aspects of airport theft required a detailed understanding of legitimate cargo handling procedures that could be exploited without triggering immediate security responses. Successful operations depended on timing that coincided with shift changes, meal breaks, or other periods when normal supervision was temporarily reduced. The movement of stolen merchandise had to appear consistent with legitimate activity, requiring vehicles and documentation that could withstand casual inspection by security personnel who were trained to recognize obvious signs of criminal activity. The spring of 1967 brought John's most significant airport operation to date, a carefully coordinated theft that involved merchandise worth several $100,000 and required the participation of more than a dozen individuals who performed various specialized functions. The planning for this operation had begun months earlier, with intelligence gathering that identified a particularly valuable shipment of European luxury goods that would be especially vulnerable during a specific window of time when security arrangements would be temporarily modified due to routine maintenance on airport surveillance systems. The execution of the operation unfolded with the precision that characterized all successful criminal enterprises, with each participant performing their assigned role according to carefully rehearsed procedures that had been refined through previous experiences. The theft itself was completed within a matter of minutes, but the preparation and subsequent disposal of stolen merchandise required weeks of additional activity that tested every aspect of John's organizational skills and his crew's commitment to maintaining operational security under pressure. The success of this operation attracted attention from criminal organizations that operated on a much larger scale than anything John had previously encountered. Representatives of established crime families began to make discreet inquiries about his activities, recognizing that someone who could coordinate successful airport operations possessed skills that could be valuable for more ambitious enterprises. These contacts represented the beginning of relationships that would eventually provide John with opportunities to advance within the hierarchy of organized crime in New York City. The financial rewards from successful airport operations provided John and his crew with resources that allowed them to live more comfortably than most residents of their East New York neighborhood. This newfound prosperity was carefully managed to avoid attracting unwanted attention from law enforcement agencies or legitimate neighbors who might become suspicious of sudden wealth that had no obvious legitimate source. The challenge of enjoying criminal profits while maintaining appropriate cover stories required a sophistication that many successful criminals never developed. The psychological impact of successful major crimes was as significant as the financial benefits they provided. John and his associates had proven to themselves and to the broader criminal community that they possessed the intelligence, courage, and organizational skills necessary for enterprises that carried serious risks and promised substantial rewards. This confidence would prove crucial as they prepared to accept even greater challenges and responsibilities in the months and years ahead. The summer of 1967 marked a period of consolidation and planning as John used the success of his airport operations to attract additional talented individuals who were seeking opportunities to advance their own criminal careers. The crew that gathered around him during this period represented a carefully selected group of individuals who had demonstrated their reliability through previous activities and who shared his vision of criminal enterprise as a pawn sophisticated business requiring professional standards of planning and execution. The relationship with law enforcement during this period was characterized by a constant awareness of surveillance and investigation that required continuous adaptation of operational procedures. John learned to recognize the signs of increased police attention, to modify activities when surveillance became too intensive, and to maintain the kind of operational security that allowed criminal enterprises to flourish without triggering serious responses from federal investigative agencies. These skills would prove invaluable as his activities attracted attention from increasingly sophisticated law enforcement organizations. The autumn of 1967 brought opportunities for John to demonstrate his leadership abilities in situations that extended beyond simple criminal operations. His crew had evolved into a tightly knit organization that looked to him for guidance in both professional and personal matters, creating relationships of mutual loyalty and dependence that transcended immediate financial considerations. The ability to inspire such dedication among associates who had numerous other options for criminal activity marked John as someone with exceptional leadership potential. The winter of 1967 and 1968 represented a turning point in John's criminal career, as the success of his airport operations brought him to the attention of established crime family leadership that was evaluating potential candidates for advancement within their organizations. These contacts would lead to opportunities that were far more significant than anything he had previously imagined, but they would also expose him to levels of scrutiny and competition that would test every skill he had developed during his years of criminal apprenticeship. The young man who had begun his airport activities as an ambitious neighborhood criminal had evolved into someone who commanded genuine respect within the broader organized crime community of New York City. The operations he had planned and executed had demonstrated not only his ability to generate substantial profits through criminal enterprise, but also his capacity for the kind of strategic thinking and organizational leadership that characterized the most successful figures in American organized crime. The reputation he had built through his airport activities would provide the foundation for advancement into levels of criminal authority that would bring both enormous power and ultimately tragic consequences. The skills and relationships that John had developed through his involvement in airport theft would serve him well as he prepared to accept greater responsibilities within organizations that operated according to traditions and expectations that had been established over decades of criminal activity in America. The success of his airport operations had proven that he possessed the combination of intelligence, courage, and leadership ability that marked individuals destined for significant roles in the complex hierarchy of organized crime. The success of John's airport operations had created opportunities that extended far beyond the immediate financial rewards of stolen cargo. By the spring of 1968, his reputation within the criminal community of Queens and Brooklyn had evolved from that of a promising neighborhood tough to someone who commanded genuine respect among established criminal organizations. This recognition brought with it both opportunities and obligations that would require him to develop new skills in leadership, organization, and the complex art of managing relationships within the hierarchical world of organized crime. The transformation from crew member to crew leader occurred gradually through a series of decisions and circumstances that demonstrated John's natural ability to inspire loyalty and coordinate complex criminal enterprises. The young men who had worked with him during the airport operations began to look to him not just for specific assignments, but for guidance in all aspects of their criminal careers. This evolution from temporary cooperation to permanent association marked the beginning of what would become one of the most formidable criminal organizations in New York City. The Social Club on 101st Avenue in Ozone Park became the unofficial headquarters for John's expanding operations, and Anyinate, a place where the daily business of organized crime was conducted with the same attention to detail and systematic approach that characterized successful, legitimate enterprises. The building itself was unprepossessing, squeezed between a dry cleaner and a small restaurant, with windows that revealed nothing of the sophisticated planning and coordination that occurred within its walls. Inside, however, it functioned as the nerve center for criminal activities that generated hundreds of thousands of dollars in annual revenue. The morning routine at the social club followed patterns that had been established through decades of criminal tradition in Italian American neighborhoods throughout New York City. Members would arrive after 10 o'clock in the morning when the legitimate business world was well into its daily routine, and conversations would begin over coffee that was always fresh and espresso that was prepared with the kind of care that reflected the importance of maintaining proper standards even in informal settings. These daily gatherings served multiple purposes, allowing for the coordination of ongoing criminal enterprises while maintaining the social bonds that held the organization together. John's approach to building his crew reflected both his understanding of traditional organized crime principles and his recognition that modern criminal enterprises required adaptations to changing circumstances. He sought individuals who possessed not only the courage and reliability that had always been essential qualities in criminal organizations, but also the intelligence and adaptability that would allow them to succeed in increasingly sophisticated illegal activities. The recruitment process was careful and deliberate, based on personal relationships and demonstrated competence rather than casual association or family connections. The territory that John's crew claimed as their primary area of operations encompassed parts of Queens and Brooklyn that had been carefully selected for their combination of criminal opportunities and relative freedom from interference by competing organizations. This geographic base included neighborhoods where loan sharking operations could flourish among small business owners who had difficulty obtaining legitimate credit, where gambling enterprises could operate with minimal risk of law enforcement interference, and where various forms of labor racketeering could generate steady income through carefully cultivated relationships with union officials and construction contractors. The loan sharking operations that formed a cornerstone of John's criminal enterprise required a sophisticated understanding of both finance and human psychology. The business involved lending money to individuals who could not obtain credit through legitimate sources, charging interest rates that were substantially higher than those available through banks or credit unions, and using the threat of violence to ensure timely repayment. Success in this field required not only sufficient capital to make initial loans, but also the organizational capacity to track multiple transactions and the reputation for reliability that encouraged both borrowers and competing criminal organizations to respect territorial boundaries. The borrowers who sought loans from John's organization represented a cross section of Queens and Brooklyn society, including small business owners who needed cash flow to meet payroll obligations, individuals who had encountered unexpected financial emergencies that exceeded their legitimate borrowing capacity, and gamblers who required funds to cover losses that threatened their personal safety. The relationship between lender and borrower in these transactions was governed by unwritten rules that had been established through decades of criminal tradition, with expectations of prompt payment balanced against recognition that excessive pressure could drive customers to seek protection from law enforcement agencies. The collection procedures employed by John's organization reflected his understanding that the systematic use of violence was more effective than random brutality in maintaining the discipline necessary for successful loan sharking operations. Borrowers who missed payments received carefully calibrated reminders that escalated from verbal warnings to physical demonstrations that were designed to encourage compliance without creating unnecessary risks of police intervention. The reputation for measured but inevitable consequences that John's crew developed during this period would prove invaluable in all of their subsequent criminal activities. The gambling enterprises that supplemented the income from loan sharking operations required different skills and presented different challenges than those associated with lending money. The operation of illegal gambling required locations that were secure from police raids, equipment that could be quickly concealed or destroyed if necessary, and relationships with customers who understood the importance of discretion. John's crew operated several types of gambling enterprises, including numbers running that provided daily opportunities for small wagers, card games that attracted more serious gamblers with larger amounts of money to risk, and sports betting that generated particularly high volume during football and basketball seasons. The numbers running operation that formed the backbone of John's gambling enterprises was based on a lottery system that allowed participants to place small bets on three-digit numbers that were selected through various methods, designed to prevent manipulation by either operators or customers. The appeal of numbers gambling lay in its accessibility to working-class individuals who could afford to risk small amounts of money in hopes of winning substantial prizes, and in its daily nature that provided regular opportunities for participation without requiring large initial investments. The coordination of numbers running required an extensive network of individuals who collected bets, recorded transactions, and distributed winnings according to established procedures that ensured fairness while protecting the operators from losses that could threaten the viability of the enterprise. John's organization employed dozens of people in various capacities related to numbers gambling, from street-level collectors who interacted directly with customers to supervisors who managed the complex record keeping systems that tracked thousands of individual transactions each week. The card games that operated under John's protection were conducted in locations that changed regularly to avoid attracting law enforcement attention, with security arrangements that allowed for rapid evacuation if circumstances required it. These games attracted participants who were willing to risk substantial amounts of money and who possessed the kind of discretion that allowed illegal gambling to flourish without creating problems for the operators. The profits from card games came not from direct participation in gambling, but from providing secure locations, protection from robbery, and various services that enhanced the comfort and safety of participants. The labor racketeering activities that represented perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of John's criminal enterprise required relationships with union officials and construction industry executives that had been developed through careful cultivation over extended periods of time. These relationships allowed John's organization to influence hiring decisions on construction projects, to ensure that certain contractors received favorable treatment in bidding processes, and to resolve labor disputes in ways that benefited all parties except the workers and consumers who ultimately paid the costs of corruption. The construction industry in Queens and Brooklyn during the late 1960s was experiencing rapid growth that created numerous opportunities for criminal organizations that understood how to exploit the complex relationships between contractors, unions, and regulatory agencies. John's crew provided various services to construction companies, including labor peace that prevented costly strikes, expedited approval processes that reduced delays in project completion, and protection from competitors who might attempt to interfere with ongoing construction activities. The summer of 1969 marked a period of significant expansion for John's organization as successful operations in their established territories provided the resources and reputation necessary to extend their influence into new geographic areas and new types of criminal activity. This growth required careful planning to avoid conflicts with existing criminal organizations while ensuring that new opportunities were exploited before competitors could establish their own operations in potentially lucrative markets. The relationships with other criminal organizations that governed the expansion of John's activities were based on mutual respect and recognition of territorial boundaries that had been established through decades of sometimes violent negotiation. The protocol for entering new areas required careful communication with existing operators, often mediated through senior figures in the organized crime community who possessed the authority and credibility necessary to resolve potential disputes before they escalated into conflicts that could threaten all parties involved. The autumn of 1969 brought John's first significant test as a leader when a dispute with a competing organization threatened to escalate into violence that could have disrupted all of his carefully developed criminal enterprises. The resolution of this conflict required diplomatic skills that demonstrated his growing sophistication as a criminal executive, as well as his understanding that the strategic use of violence was often less effective than careful negotiation in maintaining long-term stability and profitability. The winter of 1969 and 1970 represented a period of consolidation and planning as John's organization had grown to include more than 30 individuals who performed various functions within their criminal enterprises. The management of such a large group required new approaches to communication, coordination, and security that tested every leadership skill that John had developed during his years of criminal apprenticeship. The success with which he navigated these challenges would determine whether his organization could continue to grow or would fragment under the pressures of increased complexity and law enforcement attention. The young man who had begun building his crew through personal relationships and shared experiences in airport theft had evolved into someone who commanded a sophisticated criminal organization that generated substantial profits through diverse illegal activities. The principles of loyalty, discipline, and strategic thinking that guided his approach to organized crime would serve him well, as his reputation attracted the attention of even more powerful criminal organizations that were always seeking talented individuals for positions of greater authority and responsibility within the complex hierarchy of American organized crime. The delicate balance of power that governed criminal territories in Queens and Brooklyn during the early 1970s was maintained through a complex system of mutual respect, carefully negotiated boundaries, and the understood threat of violence for those who violated established agreements. John's growing organization had attracted attention not only from law enforcement agencies, but also from competing criminal groups who viewed his success with a mixture of professional admiration and territorial concern. The resolution of these tensions would require him to demonstrate that his reputation for strategic thinking extended beyond criminal enterprise to include the most serious aspects of organized crime leadership. The autumn of 1970 brought the first significant challenge to John's authority when a rival crew from Jamaica, Queens, began operating loan sharking activities in neighborhoods that had been considered part of his established territory for more than 2 years. The encroachment was not accidental, but represented a deliberate test of John's willingness and ability to defend the boundaries that his organization had established through years of careful relationship building and consistent service to local customers who had come to depend on the reliability of his operations. The rival crew was led by a man named Tommy DeSimone, whose reputation for unpredictable violence had earned him both fear and respect throughout Queens. DeSimone's approach to criminal enterprise differed significantly from John's more methodical style, relying on intimidation and brutal enforcement rather than the careful cultivation of customer relationships that characterized John's operations. This philosophical difference in approach to organized crime would prove crucial in determining how the territorial dispute would ultimately be resolved. The initial encounters between the two organizations were characterized by careful probing and psychological warfare rather than immediate violence. Representatives from each crew would appear in disputed territories, observing the other group's operations and making their presence known without directly confronting customers or interfering with ongoing business. These encounters were governed by unwritten protocols that allowed both sides to assess their opponent's strengths and weaknesses while maintaining the possibility of peaceful resolution through negotiation. John's response to the territorial challenge reflected his understanding that leadership in organized crime required not only courage and strategic thinking, but also the ability to inspire confidence among subordinates who needed to believe that their leader would protect their interests even when circumstances became dangerous. The crew members who had prospered under John's leadership during the previous 2 years were watching carefully to see how he would handle a situation that could threaten the security and profitability of all their criminal enterprises. The decision making process that would determine how to respond to DeSimone's challenge involved extensive consultation with trusted advisors and careful analysis of all available options. John understood that an overly aggressive response could escalate the conflict beyond his ability to control, while an inadequate response could be interpreted as weakness that would invite further challenges from other competitors. The solution required a demonstration of resolve that would discourage future territorial incursions without creating unnecessary risks for his organization. The planning for what would become John's definitive response to the territorial challenge began during the winter months of 1970 and 1971, when reduced activity in construction and other seasonal businesses provided time for careful preparation. The approach that emerged from these planning sessions reflected John's growing sophistication as a criminal strategist, combining elements of negotiation, intimidation, and carefully calibrated violence that were designed to achieve maximum impact with minimal risk of unwanted consequences. The psychological aspects of territorial disputes in organized crime were as important as the tactical considerations because the ultimate goal was not merely to eliminate immediate threats, but to establish a reputation that would discourage future challenges. John understood that his response to DeSimone's incursion would be carefully observed by other criminal organizations throughout New York City, and that the precedent he established would influence how his crew was perceived and treated in all future dealings with competitors. The intelligence gathering that preceded any significant action against rival criminal organizations required patience and discretion that tested every skill John had developed during his years of criminal apprenticeship. Information about DeSimone's operations had to be collected without alerting the rival crew to the extent of surveillance they were facing and the Des fine, while maintaining operational security that prevented details of John's planning from reaching potential enemies or law enforcement agencies that might use such information to their advantage. The spring of 1971 brought the culmination of months of careful preparation when circumstances finally provided the opportunity that John had been seeking to resolve the territorial dispute in a manner that would establish his dominance without creating excessive risks for his organization. The method chosen reflected his understanding that in organized crime, the message conveyed by violent action was often more important than the immediate tactical results of any specific incident. The elimination of Tommy DeSimone was carried out with the kind of precision that characterized all successful organized crime operations, involving careful coordination between multiple participants who performed specialized functions according to previously rehearsed procedures. The planning had anticipated various contingencies that might arise during the operation, with alternative approaches available if circumstances required modifications to the original strategy. The execution demonstrated the discipline and reliability that John's crew had developed through years of working together in increasingly challenging situations. The immediate aftermath of DeSimone's elimination required careful management to ensure that the intended message was properly understood by all relevant parties while avoiding unnecessary complications that could threaten the security of John's organization. The response from law enforcement agencies was anticipated and prepared for, with alibis and cover stories that had been established well in advance of the operation. The reaction from other criminal organizations was monitored carefully to ensure that the territorial dispute had been resolved without creating new conflicts that could destabilize the delicate balance of power throughout Queens and Brooklyn. The summer of 1971 marked a period of consolidation and expansion for John's organization as the successful resolution of the territorial dispute had enhanced his reputation within the criminal community while eliminating a significant source of interference with his operations. The crew members who had participated in the elimination of De Simone had demonstrated their loyalty and competence under the most demanding circumstances, strengthening the bonds of mutual trust and dependence that held the organization together. The psychological impact of successful violent action extended beyond the immediate participants to include all members of John's organization who understood that their leader possessed not only the strategic intelligence necessary for successful criminal enterprise, but also the resolve required to protect their interests when circumstances demanded decisive action. This confidence in leadership was crucial for maintaining discipline and loyalty within a group that faced constant risks from both law enforcement agencies and competing criminal organizations. The territorial gains that resulted from the elimination of De Simone provided John's organization with access to new sources of income and opportunities for expansion that had previously been unavailable. The loan sharking and gambling operations that could now be conducted without interference from competitors generated additional revenue that allowed for increased payments to crew members and investment in new criminal enterprises that in no caution required substantial initial capital. The expansion also demonstrated to other criminal organizations that John's crew was capable of sustained growth and successful defense of acquired territory. The autumn of 1971 brought new challenges as John's enhanced reputation attracted attention from higher levels of organized crime hierarchy that had previously shown little interest in his activities. Representatives from established crime families began making discreet inquiries about his operations, recognizing that someone who could successfully eliminate rivals and expand territory possessed skills that could be valuable for more ambitious criminal enterprises. These contacts represented both opportunities for advancement and potential complications that would require careful navigation. The relationship with law enforcement during this period was characterized by increased surveillance and investigation that reflected official recognition that John's organization had evolved beyond the level of neighborhood crime into something that posed broader threats to public safety. The methods used to avoid detection and prosecution required constant vigilance and adaptation as investigative techniques became more sophisticated and federal agencies began devoting additional resources to combating organized crime in Quackday, New York City. The winter of 1971 and 1972 represented a time of reflection and strategic planning as John considered how to build upon the success of his territorial expansion while avoiding the mistakes that had led to the downfall of other criminal leaders who had achieved similar levels of power and recognition. The lessons learned from the elimination of rivals and the successful defense of territory would prove invaluable as his organization prepared to accept even greater challenges and responsibilities in the years ahead. The management of violence within organized crime required a sophisticated understanding of when force was necessary and how it should be applied to achieve maximum effectiveness with minimum risk. John's approach to eliminating rivals reflected his recognition that violence was a tool of business rather than an expression of personal emotion, and that successful criminal leaders distinguish themselves through their ability to use force strategically rather than impulsively. This philosophical approach to conflict resolution would serve him well as his organization continued to grow and attracted attention from increasingly powerful criminal enterprises. The crew that had emerged from the territorial conflicts of 1971 was fundamentally different from the loose association of individuals who had begun working together during the airport operations several years earlier. The shared experiences of planning and executing violent action under dangerous circumstances had created bonds of loyalty and mutual dependence that transcended immediate financial considerations. These relationships would form the foundation for future expansion and would prove crucial as John's organization prepared to accept responsibilities that would test every skill and principle they had developed during their years of criminal apprenticeship. The young man who had successfully eliminated his first serious rivals had demonstrated not only his capacity for strategic violence, but also his ability to manage the complex aftermath of such actions in ways that enhanced rather than threatened his organization's long term prospects. The reputation he had established through these conflicts would serve as both protection and opportunity, as his activities attracted attention from the highest levels of organized crime in America, opening doors to possibilities that would bring both enormous power and ultimately tragic consequences. The expansion of John's criminal empire during the mid 1970s brought with it the recognition that sustainable success in organized crime required more than territorial control and efficient operations. The growing scale of his activities had begun to attract attention from law enforcement agencies at all levels of government, creating vulnerabilities that could threaten everything he had built unless he developed systematic methods for neutralizing official scrutiny. The solution lay in understanding that corruption was not merely a criminal activity, but a sophisticated form of relationship management that required patience, discretion, and a deep appreciation for human psychology. The corruption of public officials began with careful observation and intelligence gathering that identified individuals who possessed both the authority to protect criminal enterprises and the personal circumstances that made them vulnerable to compromise. John's organization developed systematic approaches to researching the financial situations, personal relationships, and professional ambitions of police officers, prosecutors, judges, and regulatory officials, whose cooperation could provide protection from investigation and prosecution. This intelligence gathering was conducted with the same attention to detail that characterized all successful criminal operations. The initial approaches to potentially corrupt officials were made through intermediaries who could assess receptivity without exposing John's organization to unnecessary risks if cooperation was refused. These intermediaries often included lawyers, business associates, or social acquaintances who could introduce the possibility of financial arrangements in contexts that appeared to be legitimate business discussions. The careful cultivation of these relationships required months or even years of patient development before any direct criminal propositions were presented. Detective Louis Eppolito of the New York City Police Department represented the kind of law enforcement official whose cooperation could provide invaluable protection for John's operations. Eppolito's position within the department gave him access to information about ongoing investigations, while his personal financial pressures made him receptive to supplemental income that could be presented as consulting fees or business opportunities. The relationship with Eppolito developed gradually through social interactions that established trust and mutual dependence before any explicit criminal cooperation was discussed. The methods used to corrupt police officers varied depending on individual circumstances and the specific types of protection that were required. Some officers were approached through appeals to ethnic solidarity and shared cultural backgrounds that created bonds of understanding and mutual support. Others were recruited through financial incentives that were carefully calibrated to provide meaningful benefits without creating suspicion about sudden changes in lifestyle or spending patterns. The most effective corruption often combined multiple approaches that addressed both financial needs and psychological motivations. The corruption of judicial officials required even more sophisticated approaches because judges and court personnel operated within institutional environments that were more closely monitored and regulated than police departments. The financial arrangements with judicial officials often involved legitimate business investments or legal fees that provided plausible explanations for cash transfers while ensuring that the recipients understood their obligations to provide favorable treatment in cases involving John's organization or its associates. Prosecutor James Breslin exemplified the type of career-oriented official whose cooperation could be obtained through appeals to professional advancement rather than immediate financial gain. Breslin's ambitions for higher office made him receptive to support that could enhance his prosecution statistics and public visibility, while his understanding of the political realities of law enforcement made him willing to prioritize certain cases over others based on considerations that extended beyond simple legal merit. The relationship with Breslin was maintained through intermediaries who could influence case assignments and resource allocation without creating direct connections to criminal activities. The corruption of regulatory officials who controlled permits, inspections, and compliance enforcement represented another crucial element in protecting John's legitimate business interests from interference that could threaten the money laundering and front operations that supported his criminal activities. Building inspectors, fire department officials, and licensing authorities possess the power to create expensive delays or require costly modifications that could seriously impact the profitability of restaurants, construction projects, and other legitimate enterprises. The systematic approach to corruption developed by John's organization included careful record keeping that tracked payments, services provided, and the reliability of various officials over extended periods of time. This information was essential for managing the complex network of relationships that provided protection while ensuring that compromised officials continued to provide value commensurate with the risks and expenses involved in maintaining their cooperation. The records were maintained in coded formats that provided operational security while allowing for effective management of corruption networks. The psychological aspects of corruption were as important as the financial arrangements because officials who accepted criminal money needed to rationalize their behavior in ways that allowed them to continue functioning effectively within their legitimate institutional roles. John's organization became skilled at presenting corruption as mutual assistance between friends rather than criminal conspiracy, creating emotional bonds that reinforced financial incentives while reducing the likelihood that compromised officials would experience the guilt or fear that might lead them to cooperate with internal affairs investigations. The protection provided by corrupted officials extended beyond simple advance warning about investigations to include active interference with law enforcement activities that threatened John's operations. Corrupted police officers could ensure that search warrants were executed in ways that failed to discover incriminating evidence, while prosecutors could decline to pursue cases or negotiate plea agreements that minimized penalties for arrested associates. Judges could impose lenient sentences or dismiss cases on technical grounds that effectively nullified successful prosecutions. The seasonal rhythms of corruption often coincided with budget cycles, election campaigns, and other institutional events that created opportunities for enhanced cooperation or required increased payments to maintain existing relationships. Holiday seasons provided cover for gift giving that supplemented regular financial arrangements, while political campaigns created needs for financial support that could be provided through legitimate contributions or more creative methods that left no direct trail to criminal sources. The expansion of corruption networks beyond New York City required adaptation to different legal systems, political cultures, and law enforcement practices that varied significantly between jurisdictions. The approaches that proved effective with New York police officers might be inappropriate or ineffective with federal agents or officials in other states, requiring careful research and experimentation to develop methods that achieved desired results without creating unnecessary risks. The winter of 1975 brought new challenges as federal law enforcement agencies began implementing more sophisticated approaches to detecting and preventing corruption that threatened the security of relationships that the 1975 brought new challenges John's organization had spent years developing. The Federal Bureau of Investigation introduced new internal security measures that made it more difficult to identify and approach potentially corruptible agents, while increased coordination between different law enforcement agencies reduced the effectiveness of corruption that was limited to single departments or jurisdictions. The response to increased federal scrutiny required John's organization to develop more sophisticated methods for communicating with corrupted officials and for conducting the financial transactions that maintained their cooperation. Electronic surveillance made traditional meeting places and communication methods increasingly dangerous, while financial monitoring made it necessary to develop more creative approaches to providing payments that could not be easily traced to criminal sources. The legitimate business investments that had begun as covers for criminal activities proved invaluable for corruption purposes because they provided plausible explanations for financial relationships with public officials who received consulting fees, investment, opportunities, or other benefits that appeared to be standard business practices. The restaurants and construction companies, controlled by John's organization, could provide employment for family members of corrupted officials or could hire firms owned by officials for legitimate services that were billed at premium rates. The spring of 1976 marked a period of consolidation in John's corruption networks, as the relationships that had been developed over several years began to provide consistent and reliable protection for his prizes, expanding criminal activities. The officials who had been successfully corrupted had demonstrated their value through concrete actions that protected investigations, provided advance warning of law enforcement activities, and ensured favorable treatment in legal proceedings that affected John's organization or its associates. The cultural impact of systematic corruption extended beyond immediate operational benefits to include changes in the broader social environment that made criminal activities easier to conduct and more difficult for honest officials to investigate effectively. The presence of corrupted officials within law enforcement and judicial institutions created atmospheres of suspicion and mistrust that hampered legitimate investigations while providing cover for criminal activities that might otherwise have attracted unwanted attention. The summer of 1976 brought new opportunities for corruption as the bicentennial celebrations and increased tourism created additional demands for city services while providing cover for activities that required official cooperation or oversight. The construction projects and public events associated with the bicentennial provided opportunities for profit that required regulatory approval and police cooperation, creating natural contexts for expanding existing corruption relationships while developing new sources of protection. The management of corruption networks required the same attention to personnel development and performance evaluation that characterized John's legitimate business activities. Officials who provided reliable service received increased compensation and additional opportunities for profit, while those who failed to deliver promised protection or who created security risks through careless behavior faced consequences that ranged from termination of financial arrangements to more serious forms of accountability that ensured continued reliability among remaining participants. The autumn of 1976 represented the maturation of John's approach to corruption as a systematic business practice that provided essential protection for all aspects of his criminal empire. The relationships that had been developed with law enforcement, judicial, and regulatory officials had evolved into a sophisticated network that provided comprehensive protection while creating new opportunities for expansion and profit. The success of these corruption efforts would prove crucial as John's activities attracted attention from increasingly powerful criminal organizations that were evaluating his potential for advancement within the hierarchy of American organized crime. The assassination of Paul Castellano outside Sparks Steakhouse on December 16, 1985, marked the culmination of years of careful planning and positioned John Gotti at the apex of organized crime power in America. The elimination of the Gambino family boss represented more than a simple change in leadership. It symbolized the triumph of a new generation of criminal executives who understood that success in the modern era required adaptability, media sophistication, and a willingness to challenge traditional approaches to organized crime leadership that had governed Italian-American criminal organizations for decades. The assumption of leadership within the Gambino crime family brought with it responsibilities and opportunities that dwarfed anything John had experienced during his years of building and expanding his own criminal organization. The family controlled criminal enterprises that generated hundreds of millions of dollars in annual revenue through activities that extended throughout the northeastern United States and beyond, requiring management skills that combined traditional organized crime principles with modern business practices adapted to the complexities of late 20th century American society. The daily routine of running America's most powerful crime family began each morning at the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club in Ozone Park, Queens, where John held court in an atmosphere that combined the informality of a neighborhood social club with the serious business discussions that governed multi-million-dollar criminal enterprises. The building itself was modest, squeezed between other small businesses on 101st Avenue, but its interior functioned as the unofficial headquarters for decisions that affected thousands of individuals and influenced criminal activities throughout New York City and beyond. The morning gatherings at the Bergen Club followed rituals that had been established through decades of organized crime tradition, with coffee served in small cups and conversations conducted in voices that were low enough to avoid electronic surveillance while maintaining the animated quality that characterized Italian American social interaction. The men who attended these daily meetings represented various levels of the Gambino family hierarchy, from low level soldiers seeking guidance on routine matters to senior capos who required John's approval for significant criminal ventures or territorial disputes that could not be resolved through normal channels. The transformation of John's public image from neighborhood criminal to media celebrity occurred gradually through a combination of deliberate strategy and fortunate circumstances that he exploited with the skill of a natural public relations expert. The expensive suits, carefully styled hair, and confident demeanor that earned him the nickname the Dapper Don were calculated choices designed to project an image of success and sophistication that distinguished him from the stereotype of crude, violent criminals that had characterized public perceptions of organized crime figures in previous generations. The relationship with the media that developed during John's rise to prominence represented a dramatic departure from traditional organized crime practices that emphasized secrecy and anonymity above all other considerations. John's willingness to be photographed, his occasional comments to reporters, and his generally friendly demeanor toward journalists created a public persona that combined elements of celebrity and notoriety in ways that fascinated the American public while serving his strategic interests in maintaining community support and political protection. The neighborhoods of Howard Beach and Ozone Park, where John maintained his primary residences, became informal capitals of his criminal empire, with local residents and business owners who understood that their prosperity and security depended partly on maintaining good relations with the most powerful criminal organization in New York City. The presence of Gambino family leadership in these communities created atmospheres of controlled order that were notable for their low crime rates and the respectful behavior that characterized interactions between criminals and law abiding citizens. The legitimate business interests that provided both income and cover for criminal activities had evolved into a sophisticated network of restaurants, construction companies, and other enterprises that employed hundreds of individuals while generating substantial profits through both legal and illegal means. The management of these businesses required attention to conventional business practices, regulatory compliance, and employee relations that demonstrated John's adaptability and intelligence while creating additional opportunities for money laundering and tax evasion that were essential for maintaining the financial security of his criminal organization. The construction industry activities that formed a cornerstone of Gambino family operations under John's leadership involved relationships with contractors, unions, and suppliers that allowed the organization to influence major development projects throughout the New York metropolitan area. The concrete and waste management businesses controlled by the family generated steady revenue streams while providing essential services that made their cooperation valuable to legitimate business leaders who preferred to avoid the delays and complications that could result from labor disputes or regulatory problems. The labor racketeering that characterized John's approach to construction industry involvement required sophisticated understanding of union politics and collective bargaining processes that allowed the family to extract profits while maintaining the cooperation of workers and union officials who benefited from the stability and security that organized crime involvement could provide. The ability to resolve disputes quickly and permanently was particularly valuable in industries where delays could cost millions of dollars in penalty payments and lost opportunities. The restaurant operations that served as both legitimate businesses and informal headquarters for criminal activities provided John with opportunities to cultivate relationships with politicians, business leaders, and celebrities who were attracted to establishments that offered excellent food, attentive service, and the excitement that came from associating with notorious figures in controlled environments. These social interactions were carefully managed to enhance John's reputation and influence while maintaining appropriate security and discretion. The gambling enterprises that continued to generate substantial revenue for the Gambino family under John's leadership had evolved to serve increasingly sophisticated clientele who were attracted to high stakes card games and sports betting operations that offered better odds and more favorable treatment than anything available through legitimate gambling establishments in Atlantic City or other legal jurisdictions. The management of these operations required careful attention to security, customer service, and the complex relationships that governed interactions between different criminal organizations that competed for gambling revenue. The loan sharking activities that provided fundamental income for the family required careful balance between aggressive collection procedures that ensured timely repayment and customer relations that encouraged continued borrowing while leave 2 and 5% inning H and then rive. Maintaining the discretion necessary to avoid law enforcement attention. The expansion of loan sharking into new geographic areas and customer demographics demanded adaptation to different cultural expectations and business practices while maintaining the reputation for reliability and enforced accountability that characterized successful organized crime lending operations. The winter months of 1986 and 1987 represented the peak of John's power and influence within both the criminal underworld and the broader society that surrounded and supported organized crime. Activities in New York City, the combination of successful criminal enterprises, effective corruption networks, and favorable public image had created a situation where John commanded respect and cooperation from a wide range of individuals who recognized that their own interests were best served through accommodation rather than opposition to his. Leadership. The security arrangements that protected John and his immediate associates required constant vigilance and sophisticated coordination between multiple layers of protection that included both professional bodyguards and family members who were trained to recognize and respond to various types of threats. The daily movements between homes, businesses, and social locations were planned with military precision to minimize exposure to surveillance while maintaining the accessibility that was necessary for effective leadership of a large criminal organization. The family gatherings and social events that punctuated John's routine provided opportunities for maintaining personal relationships while conducting business discussions that required the kind of privacy and informality that could not be achieved in more formal settings. The Sunday dinners at his Howard Beach home became legendary for their combination of traditional Italian-American family atmosphere and high-level criminal planning sessions that shaped the direction of Gambino family activities. For months in advance, the spring of 1987 brought new challenges as increased federal law enforcement attention began to threaten the security and profitability of activities that had generated enormous wealth during the previous years of successful expansion and consolidation. The recognition that his prominence had made him a primary target for prosecution created pressures that required careful balance between maintaining effective leadership and protecting himself from the increasingly sophisticated investigative techniques that federal agencies were employing against organized crime. The luxury and privilege that accompanied ultimate power in organized crime were reflected in every aspect of John's daily life, from the expensive clothing and jewelry that marked his status to the deference and respect that he received from everyone who came into contact with his organization. The ability to resolve disputes with a word, to generate substantial income through simple decisions, and to command loyalty from hundreds of individuals represented the culmination of decades of criminal ambition and strategic planning. The summer of 1987 marked the height of John's influence within both the criminal underworld and the legitimate society that provided the context for organized crime activities. The combination of wealth, power, and celebrity that he had achieved represented unprecedented success for someone who had begun his criminal career as a neighborhood tough in East New York, Brooklyn. The empire he commanded would soon face challenges that would test every skill and relationship he had developed during his rise to the pinnacle of American organized crime. But for this brief period, John Gotti stood as the most powerful and influential criminal leader in the United States. The philosophical reflections that accompanied moments of greatest success often included recognition that power in organized crime was inherently temporary and that the very activities that created wealth and influence also generated the enemies and vulnerabilities that would eventually threaten everything that had been achieved. The young man who had once dreamed of respect and prosperity in the streets of Brooklyn had achieved both beyond his wildest imagination, but the price of such success was only beginning to become apparent as law enforcement agencies prepared their most serious challenge to his continued freedom and authority. The pursuit of power and wealth through organized crime had brought John Gotti material success beyond anything he had imagined during his youth in East New York, but the price of such achievement was measured not only in legal vulnerability and constant danger, but also in the profound personal costs that touched every aspect of his family life and closest relationships. The very activities that had elevated him to the pinnacle of criminal authority had created an environment where normal human connections became impossible, where trust was a luxury that could prove fatal, and where the people he loved most became both his greatest motivation and his most vulnerable weakness. Victoria DeGiorgio had married John in 1966 when he was still a rising figure in neighborhood crime rather than the notorious leader he would eventually become. The young woman who had fallen in love with a charming street tough from Queens could never have anticipated the transformation that would occur over the following 2 decades, as their family life became increasingly dominated by the demands and dangers of organized crime leadership. The early years of their marriage had been characterized by the normal struggles of young couples trying to establish themselves, but by the 1980s, their relationship existed within a bubble of security measures and constant vigilance that made spontaneous affection and casual intimacy nearly impossible. The Howard Beach home that served as the family's primary residence was both a sanctuary and a fortress, with security arrangements that reflected the reality that John's prominence had made his family constant targets for rivals, law enforcement surveillance, and media attention that threatened their privacy and safety. The children who grew up in this environment learned early that their father's work was different from that of other parents, that certain topics could never be discussed outside the family, and that the luxury and privilege they enjoyed came with responsibilities and dangers that were never explicitly explained but always understood. Victoria's daily life became a careful balance between maintaining normal family routines and accommodating the security requirements that governed every aspect of their domestic existence. Simple activities like shopping for groceries or attending school events required planning and coordination that ensured appropriate protection while avoiding the kind of obvious security presence that would draw unwanted attention or NSSH create embarrassment for the children. The strain of maintaining this constant vigilance while preserving some semblance of normal family life created psychological pressures that accumulated over years of accumulated stress and anxiety. John Jr. was perhaps the family member most directly affected by his father's criminal career, as the eldest son in an Italian American crime family who understood that he would eventually face expectations about following in his father's footsteps. The psychological pressure of growing up as the son of America's most notorious crime boss created identity conflicts that were complicated by genuine affection for his father and pride in his family's success, and combined with awareness of the moral and legal problems associated with organized crime activities. The education of the Gotti children required careful consideration of schools that could provide appropriate security while maintaining the kind of academic and social environment that would prepare them for successful lives, regardless of whether they chose to follow conventional or criminal paths. The parents' desire to provide their children with opportunities for legitimate success was complicated by the reality that the family's notoriety made it difficult for the children to develop relationships and pursue interests. Without constant awareness of their father's reputation and the expectations that accompanied their surname, the social isolation that accompanied John's criminal prominence extended beyond immediate family to include relatives and close friends who found themselves under constant surveillance and occasionally subjected to legal harassment that was designed to pressure them into providing information about John's activities. Holiday gatherings and family celebrations became exercises in security planning as much as social events, with guest lists scrutinized and conversations conducted with constant awareness that electronic surveillance might be recording every word. The relationship between John and Victoria evolved over the years of his past criminal ascendancy from passionate young love to a complex partnership that combined genuine affection with the practical necessities of managing a family that existed at the center of one of America's most investigated criminal organizations. Victoria's understanding of her husband's activities was necessarily limited for her own protection, but her intelligence and intuition made her aware of the general nature of his work and the risks that such activities created for everyone connected to him. The financial benefits that organized crime leadership provided to the Gotti family were substantial, allowing for luxurious homes, expensive cars, and educational opportunities that would have been impossible on legitimate income. However, the source of this wealth created complications that affected every aspect of family financial planning, from tax obligations that required careful management to investment decisions that had to account for the possibility that assets might be subject to forfeiture if John were ever successfully prosecuted. The children's awareness of their father's criminal activities developed gradually through observation and inference rather than explicit explanation, as John and Victoria attempted to protect them from knowledge that could prove dangerous while preparing them for the realities they would eventually face as members of one of America's most notorious crime families. The balance between protecting innocence and ensuring survival required constant adjustment as the children matured and their questions became more sophisticated and harder to deflect. The extended family relationships that had provided emotional support and cultural continuity during John's early criminal career became increasingly complicated as his prominence attracted law enforcement attention that threatened anyone who maintained close contact with him. Cousins, siblings, and childhood friends found themselves forced to choose between maintaining relationships with John and protecting their own families from guilt by association that could affect their employment, social standing, and legal vulnerability. The neighborhood community in Howard Beach, that had initially taken pride in having such a successful resident, gradually became divided between those who continued to view John as a local hero who had achieved the American dream through determination and intelligence, and those who worried that his presence brought unwanted attention and potential danger to their own families. The informal protection that John's reputation provided to the neighborhood was balanced against the reality that federal surveillance and occasional violence created an atmosphere of tension that affected everyone who lived in the tension area. The media attention that John's celebrity status attracted created additional strains on family life as photographers and reporters constantly sought opportunities to capture images or gather information about the private lives of America's most notorious crime family. School events, religious ceremonies, and family outings required careful planning to avoid situations where the children might be photographed or approached by journalists seeking quotes or information that could be used in news stories about their father's activities. The psychological impact of constant security concerns affected different family members in different ways, with some adapting more successfully than others to the restrictions and vigilance that characterized their daily lives. The inability to form casual friendships or engage in spontaneous activities created a sense of isolation that was particularly difficult for the children, who watched their classmates enjoy freedoms that were impossible for members of the Gotti family. The religious faith that had provided stability and moral guidance for previous generations of Italian American families became complicated by the obvious contradiction between Catholic teaching and organized crime activities. The family's continued participation in religious ceremonies and their financial support for church activities represented both genuine devotion and a desire to maintain connections to cultural traditions that provided some sense of normalcy and continuity amid the chaos and danger of criminal life. The marriage relationship between John and Victoria required constant reinforcement and conscious effort to maintain intimacy and communication despite the pressures and dangers that surrounded their daily lives. The traditional gender roles that characterized Italian American families of their generation were complicated by Victoria's need to understand enough about John's activities to protect herself and their children while avoiding knowledge that could make her legally vulnerable or put her in physical danger. The summer vacations and family trips that had once provided relief from the pressures of criminal life became increasingly complicated by security requirements and the recognition that travel created opportunities for rivals or law enforcement to take advantage of changed routines and unfamiliar environments. The simple pleasure of spending time together as a family was shadowed by constant awareness of potential threats and the need for vigilance that made genuine relaxation nearly impossible. The autumn of 1987 brought new pressures as federal investigations intensified and the legal vulnerabilities that had always existed in the background of family life began to seem more immediate and threatening. The conversations between John and Victoria about contingency planning and the possibility of extended separation became more frequent and more detailed as they prepared for scenarios that neither wanted to consider but both understood might become necessary. The winter holidays of 1987 and 1988 carried particular poignancy as the family gathered for celebrations that everyone understood might be among the last they would share together if pending. Legal challenges resulted in lengthy prison sentences. The gift giving and festive meals were accompanied by unspoken awareness that the wealth and freedom they had enjoyed might soon be replaced by the hardships and separation that characterized the families of convicted, organized crime. Figures. The personal costs of John's criminal career extended beyond immediate family to include the broader community of Italian Americans who found themselves collectively stigmatized by the activities and media coverage of organized crime figures. The achievements and contributions of law abiding Italian American families were often overshadowed by the notoriety of criminals who received disproportionate attention from news media and popular culture that perpetuated harmful stereotypes about an entire ethnic community. The young man who had sought respect and prosperity through organized crime had achieved both beyond his early dreams, but the price of such success had been measured in relationships that could never be fully honest, in children who would carry the burden of their father's choices throughout their lives, and in a wife whose love had to compete with the demands and dangers of criminal leadership that ultimately consumed everything they had built together. The December evening of 1985 carried an unusual chill that seemed to penetrate even the warmest winter coats as Manhattan residents hurried along sidewalks lined with holiday decorations and the bustling energy of Christmas shopping season. The luxury restaurants and exclusive shops that characterized the East Side neighborhoods were illuminated with festive lights that created an atmosphere of celebration and prosperity, while the steady flow of yellow taxicabs and well-dressed pedestrians reflected the affluent rhythms of life in one of the world's most expensive urban districts. Sparks Steakhouse on East 46th Street represented the kind of establishment that attracted successful business executives, celebrities, and others who appreciated excellent food served in an atmosphere of understated elegance and discretion. The restaurant's reputation for quality and privacy had made it a favored meeting place for individuals who required both fine dining and the assurance that their conversations would not be overheard or reported by curious staff. Members or fellow diners who might recognize prominent figures from politics, entertainment, or business. Paul Castellano had chosen Sparks Steakhouse for his dinner meeting on December 16th with the same careful consideration that characterized all aspects of his leadership of the Gambino crime family. The selection of restaurants for business discussions required evaluation of security arrangements, escape routes, and the reliability of staff members who could be trusted to maintain appropriate discretion about the identities and activities of their clientele. The decision to meet at Sparks reflected Castellano's confidence in both the establishment's reputation and his own security arrangements. The relationship between Castellano and John Gotti had been deteriorating for months before the events of December 16th, as fundamental differences in philosophy and management style created tensions that threatened the stability of the Gambino family's leadership structure. Castellano's preference for traditional organized crime approaches that emphasized secrecy and avoided unnecessary public attention conflicted with John's more aggressive and media savvy approach to criminal leadership that had begun attracting unwanted scrutiny from law enforcement agencies. The planning for what would occur outside Sparks Steakhouse had been developing for weeks through a series of carefully arranged meetings and conversations that involved multiple participants who understood the enormous risks associated with eliminating a sitting crime family boss. The involved mobilization of resources and investigative techniques that reflected official recognition that such violence represented serious challenges to public order and governmental authority. The coordination between different law enforcement agencies created investigative pressures that would persist for years and ultimately contribute to the legal vulnerabilities that would threaten John's continued freedom and authority. The media attention generated by the elimination of Paul Castellano transformed the event into a public spectacle that attracted international attention while creating both opportunities and problems for John's subsequent leadership of the Gambino crime family. The extensive news coverage enhanced his reputation for boldness and effectiveness, while simultaneously increasing the scrutiny and pressure that would characterize all his future activities. The winter months following December 16th brought a period of consolidation and adjustment as John assumed formal leadership of the Gambino crime family while managing the increased attention and security concerns that resulted from the dramatic nature of his ascension to power. The transition required careful balance between establishing authority and maintaining operational security in an environment where law enforcement agencies were devoting unprecedented resources to investigating organized crime activities. The organizational changes that accompanied John's assumption of leadership reflected his understanding that modern organized crime required adaptations to changing circumstances while maintaining the traditional principles of loyalty and discipline that had enabled Italian American criminal organizations to survive and prosper for decades. The integration of new management approaches with established traditions created opportunities for increased efficiency and profitability while preserving the cultural identity that distinguished organized crime from other forms of criminal enterprise. The spring of 1986 marked the beginning of John's efforts to consolidate his authority while addressing the increased law enforcement attention that resulted from the dramatic circumstances of his rise to power. The balancing of aggressive expansion with prudent security measures required constant attention to the changing dynamics of both criminal competition and official investigation that threatened all aspects of organized crime operations in New York City. The long-term implications of the events outside Sparks Steakhouse would extend far beyond the immediate changes in Gambino family leadership to influence the broader development of organized crime in America and the evolution of law enforcement techniques designed to combat sophisticated criminal organizations. The elimination of Paul Castellano represented both the culmination of John's rise to power and the beginning of challenges that would ultimately determine whether his leadership could survive the increased scrutiny and pressure that accompanied such notoriety. The young man who had orchestrated one of the most audacious assassinations in the history of American organized crime had demonstrated not only his capacity for strategic violence, but also his willingness to accept the enormous risks and responsibilities that accompanied ultimate authority in the criminal underworld. The events of December 16th had established his reputation for decisiveness and ruthlessness while creating circumstances that would test every skill and relationship he had developed during his years of criminal apprenticeship and exploiting organizational leadership. The philosophical reflections that accompanied such moments of dramatic action often included recognition that violence in organized crime was both a tool of advancement and a source of vulnerability that created enemies and attracted to attention from law enforcement agencies that possessed greater resources and legal authority than any criminal organization. The success of the operation outside Sparks Steakhouse had solved immediate problems while creating new challenges that would require different skills and approaches to navigate successfully. The aftermath of the Sparks Steakhouse assassination had transformed John Gotti from a significant figure in organized crime into the primary target of what would become the most intensive federal investigation in the history of American Gotti. Law enforcement's war against the mafia. The audacious nature of eliminating Paul Castellano in such a public setting had captured the attention of prosecutors, investigators, and politicians who recognized that allowing such brazen violence to go unpunished would represent a fundamental failure of governmental authority that could not be tolerated in a society governed by the rule of law. The Federal Bureau of Investigation response to John's ascension to power within the Gambino crime family involved the deployment of resources and investigative and decision to proceed with such a dramatic action reflected not only personal animosity but also strategic calculation about the future direction of organized crime in New York City and the need for leadership that could adapt to changing circumstances and challenges. The afternoon of December 16th proceeded according to routines that had been established through years of criminal leadership, with Castellano conducting business meetings and maintaining social obligations that provided no indication of the danger that was gathering around him. The security arrangements that normally protected high-level organized crime figures were based on assumptions about the sources and nature of potential threats that had been accurate for previous generations but were becoming inadequate for the realities of modern criminal competition. The early evening hours brought the usual activity of Manhattan's business district as office workers concluded their daily routines and began the transition to evening entertainment and social activities. The sidewalks outside Sparks Steakhouse carried the typical flow of pedestrians who were focused on their own destinations and activities, creating an environment where unusual behavior or suspicious individuals might easily blend into the general urban atmosphere without attracting particular attention from casual observers. The coordination required for the operation that would unfold outside Sparks Steakhouse involved precise timing and careful attention to the movement patterns of both the intended targets and the numerous innocent bystanders who would be all present in the area during the early evening hours. The planners had studied the routines and security procedures that governed Castellano's activities, identifying vulnerabilities that could be exploited without creating excessive risks for the participants or unacceptable possibilities of civilian casualties. The psychological preparation required for eliminating a crime family boss involved not only courage and commitment, but also understanding of the broader implications that such action would have for the entire structure of organized crime. In New York City, the participants understood that success would bring both opportunities for advancement and increased scrutiny from law enforcement agencies that would respond aggressively to such a public challenge to their authority and RONO effectiveness. The weapon selection and positioning that preceded the actual operation reflected sophisticated understanding of urban combat techniques and the importance of ensuring both effectiveness and escape opportunities in environments where law enforcement response would be rapid and comprehensive. The participants had rehearsed their roles and practiced coordination techniques that would allow them to complete their mission quickly while minimizing the time available for unexpected complications or interference from security personnel. The moments immediately before the operation were characterized by heightened awareness and focused concentration as participants moved into their assigned positions while maintaining the casual demeanor necessary to avoid attracting attention from other pedestrians or security personnel who might be observing the area around Sparks Steakhouse. The ability to appear normal while preparing for extraordinary violence required exceptional emotional discipline and psychological preparation. The execution of the operation occurred with the precision and coordination that characterized all successful organized crime activities, with each participant performing their assigned role according to carefully rehearsed procedures that had been refined through extensive planning and preparation. The actual violence was completed within seconds, but the careful preparation and subsequent escape required much longer periods of sustained concentration and flawless execution of complex logistical arrangements. The immediate aftermath of the operation created confusion and chaos that provided cover for the participants' escape, while ensuring that law enforcement response would be focused on medical assistance and crime scene preservation, rather than immediate pursuit of suspects who had already disappeared into the urban environment. The coordination of escape routes and transportation had been planned with the same attention to detail that characterized the operation itself. The psychological impact of eliminating Paul Castellano extended far beyond the immediate participants to include all members of the Gambino crime family who understood that such dramatic action represented fundamental changes in leadership philosophy and organizational direction. The message conveyed by the operation was as important as its tactical success, establishing John's authority while demonstrating his willingness to use extreme measures to achieve his goals. The law enforcement response to the elimination of a major organized crime figure, techniques that had been developed through decades of experience in combating organized crime throughout the United States. The sophisticated surveillance technologies that were brought to bear on John's activities represented the cutting edge of law enforcement capability, combining traditional investigative methods with electronic monitoring systems that could track conversations, movements, and financial transactions with unprecedented precision and detail. The coordinated effort that emerged to investigate and prosecute John's criminal organization involved cooperation between multiple federal agencies that had previously operated independently, creating synergies and information sharing opportunities that enhanced the effectiveness of all participants while reducing the jurisdictional conflicts that had sometimes hampered earlier organized crime investigations. The task force approach that was established for the Gotti investigation would serve as a model for future law enforcement efforts against sophisticated criminal enterprises throughout the country. Bruce Mao led the Federal Bureau of Investigation efforts against John's organization with the methodical patience and attention to detail that characterized the most successful organized crime investigators. Mao's understanding of Italian-American criminal culture and his appreciation for the complex relationships that governed organized crime activities allowed him to develop investigative strategies that were specifically tailored to exploit the vulnerabilities and behavioral patterns that characterize traditional mafia organizations in the modern American environment. The electronic surveillance operations that were authorized against John and his associates represented the most extensive monitoring effort ever directed against a single organized crime figure, involving multiple listening devices that were placed in locations ranging from social clubs to private automobiles. The technical sophistication required to install and maintain these surveillance systems while avoiding detection demanded cooperation between law enforcement agencies and technology specialists who possessed expertise in communications, systems, and electronic security measures. The legal framework that governed electronic surveillance of organized crime figures had been established through decades of constitutional interpretation and legislative action that balanced law enforcement needs against privacy rights and civil liberties protections. The warrants and court orders that authorized surveillance of John's activities required detailed justification and judicial review that ensured appropriate legal safeguards while providing investigators with the tools necessary to penetrate the security measures that protected organized crime communications and planning activities. The daily routines at the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club in Ozone Park became the primary focus of federal surveillance efforts as investigators recognized that the modest storefront served as the nerve center for criminal activities that generated millions of dollars in revenue while influencing organized crime operations throughout the northeastern United States. The challenge of monitoring activities within the club required sophisticated technical approaches that could overcome the security measures and counter-surveillance techniques that John and his associates employed to protect their intimate self. Conversations from electronic eavesdropping. The installation of listening devices within the Bergen Club required months of careful planning and coordination between surveillance specialists who possessed the technical expertise necessary to place monitoring equipment in locations where it would remain undetected while providing clear recordings of conversations that could be used as evidence in future prosecutions. The operational security required for such installations demanded unprecedented cooperation between different law enforcement agencies while maintaining absolute secrecy about ongoing surveillance activities. The counter-surveillance measures employed by John's organization reflected sophisticated understanding of modern electronic monitoring capabilities and included regular sweeps for listening devices, the use of code words and indirect communication methods, and frequent changes of meeting locations that were designed to frustrate law enforcement efforts to predict and monitor criminal planning activities. The technological arms race between organized crime security measures and law enforcement surveillance capabilities created continuous pressure for innovation and adaptation on both sides of the investigation. The atmospheric pressure of constant surveillance began to affect every aspect of daily life within John's organization as members became increasingly aware that their conversations and activities were likely being monitored by federal agents who possessed the resources and legal authority to build comprehensive cases against anyone who participated in criminal enterprises. The psychological impact of such scrutiny created paranoia and tension that complicated normal business operations while forcing constant adaptation of communication methods and meeting procedures. The financial investigations that accompanied electronic surveillance efforts required analysis of complex money laundering operations and legitimate business activities that were used to conceal the sources and destinations of criminal profits The forensic accounting techniques that were employed to trace financial transactions demanded cooperation between law enforcement agencies and specialists who possessed expertise in banking regulations, tax law, and corporate finance that exceeded the normal qualifications of traditional criminal investigators. The construction industry activities that formed a cornerstone of Gambino family operations under John's leadership became particular targets of federal investigation as prosecutors recognized that labor racketeering and bid rigging represented violations of federal laws that carried severe penalties while providing clear evidence of organized crime involvement in legitimate business activities. The documentation required to prove such violations was extensive and required coordination between multiple investigative agencies that possessed different areas of expertise and legal authority. The concrete industry corruption that had generated substantial profits for John's organization provided federal investigators with numerous opportunities to develop evidence through cooperation with legitimate business owners who had been victimized by organized crime extortion and bid manipulation schemes. The willingness of some business leaders to cooperate with law enforcement investigations represented a significant departure from traditional patterns of silence and accommodation that had previously protected organized crime operations. From serious prosecution, the media attention that accompanied federal investigations of John's activities created additional pressures and complications for both law enforcement and criminal organizations, as news coverage of surveillance activities and prosecutorial strategies provided information that could be used by defense attorneys while generating public expectations for successful prosecution that influenced political and administrative decision making about resource allocation and investigative priorities. The autumn of 1986 brought increased intensity to federal investigations as electronic surveillance began producing evidence that could support prosecution of high-level organized crime figures for activities that had previously been protected by security measures and codes of silence that had frustrated earlier law enforcement efforts. The quality and quantity of recorded conversations that were being collected through sophisticated monitoring operations exceeded anything that had been achieved in previous organized crime investigations. The coordination between federal prosecutors and investigators required careful balance between the immediate benefits of arresting lower-level criminal associates and the long-term advantages of allowing surveillance operations to continue until sufficient evidence had been collected to support prosecution of the most significant figures within John's organization. The strategic patience required for such investigations tested the professional discipline of law enforcement personnel who were eager to achieve visible results while building the strongest possible cases for future prosecution. The winter months of 1986 and 1987 represented a critical period in the development of federal cases against John's organization as surveillance operations began producing evidence that documented the systematic nature of organized crime activities while providing insights into the hierarchical structure and decision-making processes that governed criminal enterprises. The accumulation of evidence through electronic monitoring created opportunities for prosecution that had previously been impossible due to the security measures and loyalty codes that protected organized crime leaders from investigation. The legal strategies that were being developed by federal prosecutors involved complex applications of racketeering statutes that had been specifically designed to combat organized crime by treating criminal enterprises as ongoing, conspiracies that could be prosecuted as single, comprehensive cases rather than collections of separate criminal incidents. The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act provided prosecutors with legal tools that were specifically tailored to address the challenges of proving organized crime involvement while circumventing the traditional defenses that had protected criminal leaders from successful prosecution. The spring of 1987 brought new developments in federal investigations as surveillance operations began producing evidence that directly implicated John in criminal activities that could support prosecution under federal racketeering statutes. The quality of recorded conversations and the systematic documentation of criminal planning activities provided prosecutors with evidence that exceeded anything that had been available in previous organized crime cases, while offering opportunities for conviction that had previously seemed impossible to achieve. The security measures that John's organization implemented in response to increased federal scrutiny included more frequent changes of meeting locations, increased use of coded communication methods, and enhanced counter-surveillance activities that were designed to detect and neutralize law enforcement monitoring efforts. The adaptation of organizational security procedures represented recognition that traditional organized crime protection methods were inadequate for defending against modern federal investigative capabilities and legal strategies. The summer of 1987 marked a turning point in federal investigations as the accumulation of evidence through electronic surveillance reached levels that could support comprehensive prosecution of John's organization under federal racketeering statutes. The coordination between different law enforcement agencies had produced a wealth of information about organized crime activities that provided prosecutors with multiple options for structuring cases that could result in significant prison sentences for high-level criminal figures. The psychological pressure of intensive federal investigation began to affect the relationships and loyalty structures that had traditionally provided stability and security for organized crime organizations, as individual members began to recognize that their continued freedom depended on maintaining distance from activities and associations that could result in lengthy prison sentences. The erosion of traditional loyalty bonds represented a fundamental threat to organized crime effectiveness that exceeded anything that had been achieved through previous law enforcement efforts. The autumn of 1987 brought final preparations for what would become the most significant organized crime prosecution in American legal history, as federal authorities prepared to arrest John and his principal associates on charges that could result in life imprisonment for those who were convicted of violating federal racketeering statutes. The careful coordination required for such arrests demanded unprecedented cooperation between different law enforcement agencies while maintaining absolute secrecy about timing and procedures that would determine the success or failure of years of intensive investigation and preparation. The relentless pressure of federal investigation during the late 1980s had begun to fracture the bonds of loyalty and mutual trust that had traditionally held organized crime families together through decades of shared danger and common purpose. The sophisticated surveillance techniques and aggressive prosecution strategies employed by law enforcement agencies created psychological stresses that tested every relationship within John's organization, as individual members began to weigh their personal survival against the collective security that had once seemed unshakable and permanent. Salvatore Gravano, known throughout the criminal underworld as Sammy the Bull, had served as John's underboss since the restructuring that followed the elimination of Paul Castellano, occupying a position of trust and authority that placed him at the center of virtually every significant decision affecting Gambino family operations. The relationship between John and Gravano had developed over years of shared criminal activities and mutual dependence, creating bonds that seemed to transcend the immediate financial considerations that characterized many organized crime associations. The daily interactions between John and his closest associates at the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club had become increasingly strained as the awareness of constant federal surveillance created an atmosphere where every conversation carried the potential for self incrimination, and every casual remark might be recorded for use in future prosecutions. The natural camaraderie and easy communication that had once characterized their relationships was gradually replaced by careful calculation and guarded exchanges that reflected the growing recognition that traditional security measures were inadequate protection against modern investigative techniques. The psychological transformation that occurred within individuals who found themselves facing the possibility of lengthy federal prison sentences was perhaps most dramatic in those who had the most to lose through continued loyalty to criminal organizations. Gravano's position within the Gambino family hierarchy had provided him with wealth, power, and respect that exceeded anything he might have achieved through legitimate means. But the same prominence that had brought such rewards also made him a primary target for federal prosecution under racketeering statutes that could result in life imprisonment. The Federal Bureau of Investigation's approach to developing cooperation from high level organized crime figures involved careful psychological analysis and strategic pressure that was designed to exploit the natural human instinct for self preservation while overcoming the cultural conditioning and loyalty bonds that had traditionally protected criminal organizations from internal betrayal. The cultivation of potential witnesses required patience, understanding of individual motivations, and sophisticated appreciation for the complex emotional and practical considerations that influence decisions about cooperation with law enforcement. The erosion of omerta, the traditional code of silence that had governed Italian American organized crime for generations, represented one of the most significant developments in the history of law enforcement efforts against the mafia in America. The willingness of high level criminal figures to provide testimony against former associates marked a fundamental shift in organized crime culture that reflected both the effectiveness of modern prosecution strategies and the managing changing values and loyalties within criminal organizations that had evolved beyond their traditional ethnic and cultural foundations. The autumn of 1989 brought the first serious indications that Gravano was reconsidering his commitment to the Gambino family organization as federal prosecutors presented him with evidence of his criminal activities. While offering alternatives to life imprisonment that required cooperation against John and other high level figures within the organization. The negotiations between Gravano and federal authorities were conducted with extraordinary secrecy and security measures that protected both the potential witness and the ongoing investigation from discovery by criminal associates who would respond violently to evidence of betrayal. The psychological pressure that accompanied Gravano's decision-making process involved not only concern for his personal freedom, but also consideration of the impact that cooperation might have on his family members who had enjoyed the benefits of his criminal success while remaining largely insulated from direct involvement in illegal activities. The witness protection program that federal authorities could provide offered both physical security and financial support that might allow his family to rebuild their lives away from the criminal environment that had shaped their previous represent's existence. The practical considerations that influenced Gravano's ultimate decision to cooperate with federal authorities included realistic assessment of the evidence that prosecutors had accumulated through years of electronic surveillance and financial investigation, the quality and quantity of recorded conversations and documented criminal activities provided prosecutors with cases that seemed virtually impossible to defend successfully, creating circumstances where cooperation offered the only realistic hope for avoiding life imprisonment or other extreme penalties. The winter months of 1989 and 1990 were characterized by intensive debriefing sessions between Gravano and federal investigators who sought to extract maximum information about Gambino family operations. While preparing comprehensive cases against John and other high level figures within the organization. The detail and specificity of Gravano's knowledge about criminal activities provided prosecutors with evidence that exceeded anything they had previously obtained through electronic surveillance or other investigative techniques. The security measures required to protect Gravano during his cooperation with federal authorities reflected recognition that discovery of his betrayal would result in immediate and violent retaliation from criminal associates who understood that his testimony could destroy their organization and result in lengthy prison sentences for numerous individuals. The safe houses and protection details that were established for Gravano and his family represented substantial commitments of resources and personnel that demonstrated federal determination to maintain the cooperation that was essential for successful prosecution. The impact of Gravano's decision to cooperate extended far beyond the immediate threat to John's organization to include broader implications for the future of organized crime in America, as other high-level figures began to recognize that traditional loyalty bonds were no longer sufficient protection against modern law enforcement capabilities and prosecution strategies. The precedent established by Gravano's cooperation would influence the behavior and decision-making of criminal leaders throughout the country who faced similar choices between loyalty and survival. The spring of 1990 brought additional evidence of the breakdown in traditional organized crime loyalty structures as other members of John's organization began to consider cooperation with federal authorities who offered alternatives to lengthy prison sentences in exchange for testimony against higher-level figures. The cascade effect of multiple cooperating witnesses created investigative opportunities that exceeded anything that had been achieved in previous organized crime prosecutions, while demonstrating the vulnerability of criminal organizations to systematic law enforcement pressure. The daily atmosphere within the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club became increasingly tense and suspicious as John and his remaining associates attempted to identify the sources of information that were clearly reaching federal investigators through channels that bypassed traditional security measures and counter-surveillance techniques. The paranoia that accompanied awareness of betrayal within the organization created additional stress and complicated normal business operations while forcing constant reevaluation of relationships and communication procedures. The cultural implications of widespread cooperation with law enforcement represented fundamental challenges to the ethnic and traditional foundations that had sustained Italian American organized crime for generations in the United States. The abandonment of omerta by individuals who had been raised within criminal families and had achieved success through adherence to traditional values, marked a historical transition that reflected broader changes in American society and ASCRI, immigrant community relationships with governmental authority. The technological advances that had enabled federal investigators to penetrate organized crime security measures also contributed to the breakdown of trust within criminal organizations, as electronic surveillance capabilities made it impossible to determine whether betrayal was occurring through human cooperation or through technical means that had defeated traditional counter surveillance measures. The uncertainty about the sources of law enforcement information created additional suspicion and paranoia that damaged relationships even among individuals who remained loyal to their criminal associates. The summer of 1990 marked a period of accelerating deterioration in the relationships and loyalty structures that had previously held John's organization together through years of successful criminal enterprise and shared prosperity. The combination of federal pressure, internal suspicion, and individual self preservation instincts created circumstances where traditional organized crime, discipline, and hierarchy could no longer maintain order and security within the criminal enterprise. The philosophical reflections that accompanied such fundamental changes in organized crime culture often included recognition that the values and traditions that had sustained criminal organizations were being overwhelmed by modern realities that made traditional approaches to loyalty and secrecy inadequate for survival in contemporary American society. The breakdown of traditional bonds represented not only tactical failures, but also cultural transformations that would permanently alter the nature and effectiveness of organized crime in the United States. The autumn of 1990 brought final confirmation that Gravano's cooperation with federal authorities was providing prosecutors with evidence that would support comprehensive prosecution of John's organization under Brackley's racketeering statutes that could result in life imprisonment for the most significant figures within the criminal enterprise. The detailed testimony that Gravano was prepared to provide represented the culmination of years of federal investigation while offering prosecutors opportunities for conviction that had previously seemed impossible to achieve. The winter preparations for what would become the most significant organized crime trial in American legal history were characterized by extraordinary security measures and legal maneuvering that reflected recognition by all parties that the outcome would determine not only the fate of individual defendants, but also the future effectiveness of federal strategies for combating sophisticated criminal organizations throughout the country. The breakdown of traditional loyalty structures had created opportunities for prosecution that would test every aspect of the American legal system's capacity to address organized crime through conventional judicial procedures. The young man who had built his criminal empire through careful cultivation of loyalty and respect was facing the ultimate betrayal by individuals who had shared in his success while pledging their devotion to the principles and traditions that had governed their criminal association. The breakdown of trust within his organization represented not only personal tragedy, but also historical transition that marked the end of an era in American organized crime and the beginning of new realities that would reshape criminal enterprises throughout the country. The isolation that accompanied awareness of betrayal created psychological pressures that tested every aspect of John's leadership abilities and personal resilience as he prepared to face legal challenges that would determine whether the empire he had built could survive the systematic destruction of the relationships and loyalties that had provided its foundation. The trust that had been broken could never be fully restored, but the consequences of such betrayal would continue to influence organized crime, culture, and law enforcement strategies for generations to come. The morning of December 11th, 1990, brought an unusual stillness to the streets of Howard Beach as federal agents prepared to execute the arrest warrants that would end John Gotti's reign as the most powerful organized crime leader in America. The coordinated operation that had been planned for months involved hundreds of law enforcement personnel from multiple agencies who understood that the arrests they were about to make represented the culmination of one of the most intensive criminal investigations in federal law enforcement history. The careful choreography required for simultaneously arresting John and his principal associates involved precise timing and coordination that left nothing to chance, as federal authorities recognized that any delays or complications could provide opportunities for escape or the destruction of evidence that might prove crucial for successful prosecution. The months of preparation that preceded the arrests had included detailed surveillance of daily routines, escape routes, and security arrangements that protected high-level organized crime figures from the kind of coordinated law enforcement action that was about to unfold. John's arrest occurred at the Ravenite Social Club on Mulberry Street in Little Italy, the Manhattan headquarters that had served as his primary meeting place since assuming leadership of the Gambino crime family. The federal agents who surrounded the building in the early morning hours represented multiple law enforcement agencies that had cooperated in building the cases that would finally bring John and his organization to trial under federal placement. Racketeering statutes that promised lengthy prison sentences for those who were convicted. The transformation from America's most notorious crime boss to federal prisoner occurred within minutes, as John was handcuffed and read his rights in the same location where he had held court over criminal enterprises that generated millions of dollars in annual revenue. The irony of his arrest in the heart of Little Italy was not lost on observers who recognized that the neighborhood had served as the symbolic center of Italian-American organized crime for generations of criminal leaders who had believed themselves beyond the reach of conventional law enforcement. The federal courthouse in Brooklyn became the stage for what would be recognized as the most significant organized crime trial in American legal history, and HONOR is aft of like thou, as prosecutors prepared to present evidence that had been accumulated through years of electronic surveillance, financial investigation, and witness cooperation. The massive security arrangements that surrounded the courthouse reflected official recognition that the trial would attract international attention while creating potential targets for violence from criminal associates who sought to 24 prevent testimony that could destroy their organizations. Judge I. Leo Glasser presided over the proceedings with the careful attention to legal procedure and constitutional rights that characterized federal courts when addressing cases of such magnitude and public interest. The selection of jury members required extraordinary security measures and extensive background investigations to ensure that the individuals who would determine John's fate could not be intimidated or corrupted by criminal organizations that possessed substantial resources and motivation to influence the outcome of the trial. The prosecution team, led by Assistant United States Attorney John Gleason, presented their case with methodical precision that built systematically from electronic surveillance evidence through financial documentation to the dramatic testimony of cooperating witnesses who had participated in the criminal activities they were describing. The quality and quantity of evidence that prosecutors had accumulated provided them with multiple approaches to proving the racketeering charges that could result in life imprisonment for John and his co-defendants. The electronic surveillance recordings that formed the backbone of the prosecution case included hundreds of hours of conversations that documented criminal planning, territorial disputes, and organizational decisions that provided unprecedented insight into the daily operations of a major organized crime family. The technical quality of the recordings and the detailed transcription work that made them comprehensible to jury members represented years of specialized effort by law enforcement personnel who had devoted their careers to understanding and combating organized crime. Salvatore Gravano's testimony represented the emotional and dramatic climax of the prosecution case, as John's former underboss provided detailed accounts of criminal activities that he had witnessed and participated in during years of close association with the defendant. The impact of Gravano's testimony extended beyond the specific criminal acts he described to include broader insights into the culture, traditions, and operational methods that governed organized crime in America. The defense strategy employed by John's legal team focused on challenging the credibility of cooperating witnesses while arguing that electronic surveillance evidence had been taken out of context and misinterpreted by prosecutors who were motivated by political considerations rather than genuine pursuit of justice. The defense attorneys recognized that their client's reputation and public notoriety created additional challenges that required careful jury selection and strategic presentation of alternative explanations for the evidence that all Socian prosecutors had presented. The atmosphere within the courtroom during the trial was characterized by extraordinary tension and security measures that reflected recognition by all participants that they were involved in proceedings that would influence the future of organized crime prosecution throughout the United States. The presence of armed federal marshals, metal detectors, and other security arrangements created an environment that was unlike anything typically associated with civilian criminal trials. The media coverage that surrounded the trial transformed the proceedings into a public spectacle that attracted international attention while providing the American public with unprecedented insight into the operations and culture of PAFAS, organized crime. The extensive newspaper, television, and magazine coverage of the trial proceedings created a level of public awareness and interest that exceeded anything associated with previous organized crime prosecutions. The winter months, during which the trial proceeded, were characterized by daily courtroom sessions that systematically presented evidence of criminal activities spanning decades of organized crime leadership. The complexity of the charges and the volume of evidence required careful attention from jury members who were asked to understand and evaluate criminal enterprises that operated according to principles and methods that were fundamentally different from legitimate business activities. The cross-examination of cooperating witnesses provided defense attorneys with opportunities to highlight the self-serving motivations that had led former criminal associates to testify against John while questioning the cross-expat reliability of testimony from individuals who had admitted to participating in numerous serious crimes. The challenge of defending against insider testimony required legal strategies that could discredit witnesses without appearing to defend criminal activities that were clearly documented through electronic surveillance. The financial evidence that prosecutors presented during the trial documented the enormous profits that had been generated through various criminal enterprises, while demonstrating the sophisticated money laundering operations that had been employed to conceal the sources and destinations of illegal income. The forensic accounting work that supported these presentations required cooperation between law enforcement agencies and financial specialists who possessed expertise in banking regulations and corporate finance. The spring of 1992 brought the conclusion of testimony and the beginning of jury deliberations that would determine whether the years of federal investigation and prosecution had succeeded in convicting the most powerful organized crime leader in America. The deliberation process required jury members to evaluate massive amounts of evidence while applying complex legal standards that had been specifically designed to address the challenges of prosecuting sophisticated criminal organizations. The psychological impact of the trial proceedings on John became increasingly apparent as the weight of evidence and testimony accumulated into a comprehensive picture of criminal activity that seemed to leave little room for reasonable doubt about his guilt under federal racketeering statutes. The recognition that his criminal career was likely ending created emotional stresses that tested his ability to maintain the composure and confidence that had characterized his public persona throughout years of criminal leadership. The verdict of guilty on all charges was delivered on April 2nd, 1992, ending John's reign as America's most powerful crime boss while validating years of federal law enforcement effort against organized crime. The conviction represented not only personal tragedy for John and his family, but also historical significance as a demonstration that modern investigative techniques and prosecution strategies could successfully challenge even the most sophisticated criminal organizations. The sentencing hearing that followed the conviction provided John with his final opportunity to address the court and the public before beginning what would likely be a life sentence in federal prison. The statements that were made during the sentencing proceeding reflected the reality that traditional organized crime leadership was facing unprecedented challenges from law enforcement agencies that possessed greater resources and legal lawless authority than any criminal organization could hope to match. The federal prison system that would become John's permanent home was designed to house the most dangerous criminals while preventing the kind of communication and coordination that might allow organized crime leaders to continue directing criminal activities from behind bars. The security measures and isolation procedures that governed maximum security federal facilities represented recognition that convicted organized crime figures retained both the motivation and the capability to influence criminal possible enterprises, even after conviction and imprisonment. The summer of 1992 marked the beginning of John's adjustment to federal prison life that would continue until his death a decade later. The transition from unlimited power and wealth to the restricted existence of federal imprisonment represented perhaps the most dramatic reversal of fortune in the history of American organized crime, serving as a powerful demonstration of the ultimate consequences that awaited those who chose criminal careers over legitimate alternatives. The philosophical reflections that accompanied such dramatic changes in circumstances often included recognition that the pursuit of power and wealth through criminal means carried inevitable consequences that could not be avoided. Indefinitely, regardless of the intelligence, charisma, or organizational skills that might temporarily defer legal accountability. The young man who had sought respect and prosperity through organized crime had achieved both beyond his early dreams, but the price of such success had ultimately included the loss of everything he had worked to build and protect throughout his criminal career. The reckoning that John faced in federal court represented more than simple criminal justice proceedings, but marked the end of an era in American organized crime and the beginning of new realities that would reshape criminal enterprises throughout the country for generations to come. The harsh fluorescent lighting of the United States Penitentiary at Marion, Illinois, cast stark shadows across the small concrete cell that became John Gotti's final residence on June 10th, 2002. The man who had once commanded the streets of New York City from expensive restaurants and social clubs now lay dying from throat cancer in the most secure federal prison in America, his voice reduced to whispers and his body ravaged by the disease that would claim his life at the age of 61. The transformation from the Dapper Don to federal prisoner number 08870 was complete, but the impact of his life and criminal career would continue to resonate through American culture and law enforcement for decades to come. The immediate aftermath of John's death brought an outpouring of conflicting emotions from communities that had been affected by his criminal activities and public persona. In the neighborhoods of Queens and Brooklyn, where he had built his reputation, some residents mourned the passing of someone they viewed as a local success story who had achieved wealth and recognition despite humble beginnings. Others recognized his death as the end of an era that had brought violence and corruption to their communities while celebrating criminal behavior that ultimately harmed innocent people. The media coverage that surrounded John's death reflected the complex relationship between American society and organized crime figures who had achieved celebrity status through their criminal activities. Newspaper obituaries and television retrospectives struggled to balance factual reporting about his criminal career with recognition of the charisma and intelligence that had made him a compelling public figure. The extensive coverage demonstrated the continuing fascination with organized crime that had made John a household name throughout America and beyond. The law enforcement community viewed John's death as the conclusion of a career that had fundamentally changed how federal agencies approached organized crime investigation and prosecution. The techniques that had been developed to combat his organization, including sophisticated electronic surveillance and witness cooperation programs, became standard methods for addressing complex criminal enterprises throughout the United States. The legal precedents established through his prosecution under federal racketeering statutes provided prosecutors with tools that would prove invaluable in future cases against sophisticated criminal organizations. The Federal Bureau of Investigation's assessment of John's impact on organized crime emphasized both his effectiveness as a criminal leader and his ultimate role in accelerating the decline of traditional Italian American crime families. His public persona and media attention had attracted scrutiny that made it increasingly difficult for organized crime to operate with the secrecy and anonymity that had protected earlier generations of criminal leaders. The publicity that surrounded his activities had educated the public about organized crime methods while providing law enforcement with political support for more aggressive investigative approaches. The academic study of organized crime was profoundly influenced by the documentation and evidence that emerged from John's prosecution, providing researchers with unprecedented insight into the daily operations and cultural traditions that governed American crime families. The thousands of hours of electronic surveillance recordings and the detailed testimony of cooperating witnesses created a historical record that allowed scholars to understand organized crime with a level of detail that had never before been available to legitimate researchers. The international impact of John's career extended beyond American law enforcement to influence organized crime investigations throughout the world. As countries facing similar challenges, from sophisticated criminal organizations, adopted techniques and legal approaches that had proven successful against the Gambino crime family. The cooperation between American and international law enforcement agencies that developed during the investigation of John's activities established patterns of information sharing and coordinated action that continue to characterize modern efforts against transnational organized crime. The cultural legacy of John's life was perhaps most visible in the entertainment industry, where his story became the inspiration for countless movies, television programs, and books that explored themes of power, ambition, and the American dream gone wrong. The romanticization of his criminal career in popular culture created complex moral questions about society's fascination with criminal figures while potentially glamorizing activities that caused genuine harm to communities and 18 individuals. The neighborhood of Howard Beach, that had served as John's primary residence during his years of power, experienced lasting changes that reflected both the notoriety he had brought to the area and the broader social transformations that occurred throughout New York City during the 1980s and 1990s. Property values and community demographics shifted as some residents sought to distance themselves from the area's association with organized crime, while others took pride in their connection to such a notorious figure. The Italian American community grappled with the complex legacy of John's prominence, as his criminal career had reinforced harmful stereotypes while also demonstrating the intelligence and organizational capabilities that characterized successful Italian American entrepreneurs in both legitimate and illegitimate enterprises. Community leaders worked to distinguish between criminal figures and the vast majority of Italian Americans who had achieved success through legal means while contributing positively to American society. The legal system's approach to organized crime prosecution was permanently altered by the precedents established through John's case, particularly the effective use of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act to prosecute entire criminal enterprises rather than individual criminal acts. The success of this approach encouraged prosecutors throughout the country to apply similar strategies against various forms of organized criminal activity, from street gangs to white-collar crime syndicates. The evolution of organized crime following John's conviction and death reflected both the effectiveness of federal law enforcement strategies and the adaptability of criminal organizations that faced increased scrutiny and unpursed prosecution. Traditional Italian American crime families were gradually replaced by more ethnically diverse criminal organizations that operated with greater security awareness and more sophisticated understanding of modern investigative techniques. The Witness Protection Program that had been crucial for securing Salvatore Gravano's cooperation against John became a standard tool for federal prosecutors seeking to penetrate criminal organizations that had previously been protected by codes of silence and loyalty. The success of this approach encouraged other high-level criminals to consider cooperation while forcing criminal leaders to develop new methods for ensuring loyalty and preventing betrayal within their organizations. The financial impact of John's criminal career extended beyond the immediate profits and losses associated with his organization's activities to include broader economic effects on legitimate businesses and communities that had been subject to organized crime, extortion, and corruption. The elimination of his organization's influence in construction and waste management industries allowed for more competitive pricing and improved service quality that benefited consumers throughout the New York metropolitan area. The educational value of John's story for future generations lies in its demonstration of how intelligence, charisma, and organizational skills can be misdirected toward criminal ends while ultimately resulting in personal tragedy and harm to families and communities. His life serves as a cautionary tale about the ultimate consequences of choosing illegal shortcuts over legitimate paths to success and recognition. The technological advances that had enabled law enforcement to penetrate John's organization continued to evolve following his conviction, creating increasingly sophisticated capabilities for monitoring and investigating criminal activities while raising important questions about privacy rights and the balance between security and civil liberties in democratic societies. The philosophical questions raised by John's life and career include fundamental issues about the nature of power, the relationship between individual ambition and social responsibility, and the ways in which cultural and economic circumstances can influence personal choices about legal and illegal activities. His story illustrates the complex interactions between personal character, environmental influences, and societal opportunities that shape individual destinies. The continuing fascination with John's story reflects broader American interests in themes of success, power, and the consequences of moral choices that transcend the specific circumstances of organized crime. His life represents both the appeal and the ultimate futility of seeking respect and wealth through illegal means in a society that offers legitimate alternatives for those willing to pursue them through conventional channels. The young man who had once walked the streets of East New York, dreaming of respect and prosperity, had achieved both beyond his early imagination, but the price of such success had been measured in relationships destroyed, lives lost, and communities harmed by the violence and corruption that inevitably accompanied organized criminal enterprise. His story serves as both inspiration and warning about the possibilities and perils of American ambition when channeled through illegal rather than legitimate means. The final judgment of John Gotti's life and legacy must balance recognition of his intelligence and leadership abilities against acknowledgement of the harm he caused through decades of criminal activity that enriched himself and his purport associates while imposing costs on society that extended far beyond any immediate financial losses. His death marked the end of a remarkable criminal career, but not the conclusion of ongoing efforts to understand and combat the organized crime that continues to challenge law enforcement and threaten communities throughout America and the remarkable world.